How does the fourth industrial revolution influence geospatial industry and its adoption across user segments? Are governments and businesses ready to scale up their geospatial adoption and transition to knowledge services through updated business models? Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure, or GKI, aims to place geospatial at the heart of 4IR and knowledge economy and make geospatial everyone's business through the creation of an interconnected platform where geospatial data from different disciplines, formats, and organizations are integrated in an organized and usable manner. The geospatial ecosystem stakeholders need to work together to co-create the next generation geospatial infrastructure and develop an integrated policy framework and overarching standards for data sharing and interoperability to guide the ecosystem in the effective use of geospatial knowledge for solving global challenges. Location-based knowledge can be extracted from data through predictive analysis, modeling, and simulation, and be made accessible to a wider audience through the development of user-friendly applications and dashboards. The geospatial sector will thus migrate into the wider knowledge or technology ecosystem, focusing on services and improved user experiences, and reach into other sectors for new customers and partnerships. GKI will lead to a broad, collaborative, connected, and innovative geospatial sector focused on users' future needs, cooperating and disrupting to meet them.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you are. This is Sanjay Kumar, representing Geospatial Media. Welcome to GKI Summit. You just saw the video. I don't need to explain more about GKI. Having its theme as mapping your way in 4IR. This is the right time to talk about because we are living in fourth industrial age. Digitalization and digital age is right here, and we all have experienced its benefits. Today, I'm going to open the conference with a conversation with my friend and colleague, Stephen Swinefest, who is Director, United Nations Statistics Department, and he's also driving UNGGIM, which is one of the flagship programs. I think probably the most important program at this stage in the last 10 years, which has come forward to help the geospatial community and organize and guide geospatial community to collaborate and exchange knowledge. So welcome, Stephen.
Good morning. Thank you for having me at this wonderful, great summit.
Let's get going. So, Stephen, what do you think about the whole debate around climate crisis and sustainability? What is it all about, and how is it important?
Climate crisis and sustainability, it is all around us. I mean, we here in the United States, I'm based in New York at the United Nations. We saw it again with the storm in Texas, I think, which brought it back home to everybody, that something is happening. And climate crisis and sustainability, it just shows us a couple of very fundamental truths. I mean, we are all connected. Nobody can solve a problem somewhere alone in their corner. It is really a global problem that the whole planet has to come together to solve. And it also, so we have to do it in solidarity across the planet. And we have to do it in solidarity over time, because it reminds us the time dimension that we have to be out of solidarity to the next generations. And that's what sustainability is also all about, the fundamental insight that you cannot segment our complex reality and say, okay, I manage the economy, or I manage the environment, or I manage some societal problems, and I ignore the interconnectedness, or I manage one part of the world. It is just not possible. We have to come all together and manage these things together with a long-term vision. And I think that's the fundamental idea and ethics, I would also say, of sustainability. Perhaps with one addition, there is a fundamental human underlying philosophy, because sustainability, our United Nations Sustainability Program, is connected with the mantra, leave no one behind, recognizing that each individual human being is part of the global community, no matter where they are, who they are, how old they are. We are all in this together.
What you brought is that this world is complex, interconnected, interdependent, and we need solidarity to address this whole sustainability. Well, geospatial information is considered to be one of the foundation layer of which helps integrate information from different sectors and different disciplines and provides a kind of geographical context to this. So in this backdrop, how do you think that the geospatial knowledge infrastructure is helping to pursue the mission of United Nations and UNGGIM and bigger sustainability?
Well, I mean, I always joke and I say I'm only a statistician. So I was brought up a little bit as a numbers person, and then I only saw the light rather late in my life, when about 10 years ago, my portfolio of statistics, numerical official statistics, was broadened to integrate geospatial information. But I've been a believer since the beginning, and I'm even more fervently so, because the geospatial dimension lets us understand, it really has enormous integrative power. It lets us understand where things happen. It brings in this dimension that I mentioned earlier, the solidarity across the planet. How do we manage things on our planet? How do we do policy? We do it at various levels. We do it at the local level, we do it at the regional and subnational level, national, sometimes continental and global level. And at each level, in order to manage, you need information. And this information has to be consistent. It has to be a package. It has to be an architecture, that I always say. And only geospatial allows us to bring all of this together in its various geographical dimensions. And it also brings the sectors together. I mean, if I have a good map, I remember one of the first moments where I really understood it was when I saw a Mexican map of the impact of a hurricane, and it traced where the hurricane had affected the country, and then it had submaps how economic infrastructure, factories had been affected, how social infrastructure, schools and hospitals had been affected, and human settlements, etc., etc. So in one kind of image, you brought all of this: the economic impact, the social impact, the environmental impact, what had been destroyed in terms of forest or in environmental infrastructure. So geography, geospatial information allows us to bring all of this together and understand the interconnectedness.
Oh, that's wonderful. You mean to say that it brings a kind of integrated information framework which allows context or reality, closer to the reality of various disciplines working together. Well, of late, in last 10 years, GGIM has come forward. It's I think it's 10th anniversary of GGIM. And in last 1 year, what we have seen, 1 year or 2 years, what we have seen is that host of IT and engineering enterprises, be it Salesforce, SAP, Amazon, Intel, they all have been developing geospatial divisions, as well as at the same time companies like Siemens, Honeywell. These are big, giant companies in the field of IT and engineering, and they have come in this space of geospatial services and solutions. So, how do you think that this mainstreaming of geospatial is helping democratization of data and scalability of applications?
No, I'm very excited to see this, and I think even, I mean, first of all, the appreciation in the large public is growing by the minute. All of the applications that we have on our phone that are geospatially connected, when we look for a restaurant or something in our neighborhood, or some, so people, when we look for the weather all of these things. So, and individuals, even with the crisis right now with COVID, they better understood how important the geospatial dimension is. And I was very excited because one of my fundamental concerns in life is a good integration of numbers and statistics and geospatial information. And as we sadly went through the crisis, the first thing that people were looking at when they switched on their television were maps and numbers. So it was not only important to know how many people were affected by this pandemic, but also exactly where they were. It was not only the total number, but you needed to know where they are. So I think the appreciation is increasing. I mean, and this is also true for the private sector, the companies that you just mentioned. I mean, everybody is realizing how important it is to understand and to manage the geospatial dimension. I mean, for me, it makes my life a little bit more scary. I mean, I'm a public service person, so when I started with this geospatial journey, I remember my first encounter with the geospatial private sector, and I was supremely nervous. I knew how to, for my long career, how to talk to government representatives, but when I walked in one of your meetings, you told me these people are different. This is industry captains. They think differently. They talk differently. And I really realized that very, very quickly. And it was scary for me, but it was also a big opportunity. I always say it's all about language. We need to talk to each other to understand each other. And now and we have created a partnership arrangement between the private sector and the public sector. And so we're bringing them also to the table at the United Nations. I mean, and this industry group is growing. I mean, all of the data and knowledge industry partners, I mean, by the day, our partnership is growing. And I think it's relevant because each and every one comes from a slightly different perspective. They have a slightly different notion what data is. Data can be so much. It can be a number, it can be an image, it can be a satellite image, it can be a name. And managing data responsibly and putting data together in a way that they make sense to really generate what you say is knowledge and understanding, and also to be responsible in your use of data, because how do you protect privacy, how do you make sure that the right people get the right information? There's an efficiency dimension. So all of this we can only solve if we bring everybody together.
Oh, that's great. Stefan, before I let you go, I have a last question to you. Is that you talked about that there is a lot of awareness about this technology now that's been established. We have also seen that a lot of public policy reforms have taken place in 2021, be it UK, US, Holland, Australia, India, and across various countries of European Union as well. And then there's a debate going on strengthening geospatial infrastructure all around the world because it's important and been realized. So, how do you see that this public policy, reforms as well as the political level attention, and now the mainstream corporate attention also is on geospatial? Is it going to help your mission?
No, absolutely. I'm very excited about it. I mean, you just sent me, when was it, not too long ago, last week or so, the new geospatial policy framework of India. I don't know whether I got the right name, the correct name, but I mean, it's just one example. The public sector has primarily a regulatory function. So, I mean, they do have quite a lot of influence of how data are treated and how data travel around a particular country or across borders. And I think all of these new policy examples, they show the understanding that we need to, I like that expression, unleash the power of data. You need to put the data, and geospatial data in particular, in the hand of more people under certain conditions, that they are being treated, the data is treated responsibly, and that is kind of the framework that the government has to set. But you see a liberalization. Data is not, and geospatial data is not only in the hand of certain sectors. You see a democratization. I mean, geospatial information is put in the hand of each and every one, of each citizen, and that unleashes the creativity. That gives also the private sector the opportunity to have startups, to have young people who are most concerned, naturally so, about the long-term dimensions. Young people, by definition, need to be our guidance and our ambassadors for sustainability. so they can unleash the power of information if they have access to it, if they can work with it, and they can help us to discover even new dimension of knowledge, because the data is just the description of a reality. What we really want to achieve is a deeper understanding of the reality, and that depends on our philosophy, on our ethics behind, and on our ability to put different data pieces of the data puzzle intelligently together.
So what if I have to summarize your talk is basically talking about, you presented about the holistic view of sustainability and increasing role of data integration and data ecosystem in addressing that complex problem of the world. And you also talked about mainstreaming of geospatial applications and democratization through the public policy reforms. And finally, what a wonderful thing what you talked about is the next generation, the youth. Youth is more aware, and they are, I think, probably more, accustomed to the, more collaborative framework of working together. And I think that's a very positive sign. With this, I would like to thank you once again and let you go. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and greetings to everybody out there from our wonderful GDIM community.
Thank you.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's John Kedar, and I'm going to take you through very briefly the geospatial knowledge infrastructure. And the video, actually, that we've had and the discussion from Sanjay and Stefan have said a lot, actually. But it's very interesting because Sir David Attenborough yesterday said the biggest challenge that we face is climate change. And nothing exemplifies better the challenge that can be overcome, in a sense, by greater knowledge and indeed partnerships. And that knowledge is what we're really trying to strive for with geospatial knowledge infrastructure, moving away from data, moving away from our conventional thinking to trying to think through to the future. So I'm going to spend 15 minutes taking you through a journey about geospatial knowledge infrastructure. Now, our world is changing, and it's changing because of this fourth industrial revolution that we are into very fast and changing very fast. Geospatial data is no longer the preserve of just a few, but it is absolutely of the masses, and it's central to all of our lives. It powers the apps we use. It creates the data to businesses from the apps we use so that they have better knowledge about us and our spending habits. Data is increasing in value, and I'll come back to that. Up above us, 90 different constellations of Earth observation satellites, and of course the GNSS network, giving us precise positioning, open precise positioning to everyone with a device anywhere in the world. And that creates even more data, doesn't it? Sensors are part of the internet, the things. Sensors are just about everywhere. And I mention them because we can use sensors and AI, for example, for face recognition. And that is being used in many countries and has been used in some countries during COVID. And of course, the web is developing more into a knowledge-based infrastructure, the ability to actually seek out understanding. So that's really important. These things are changing, and artificial intelligence, which has been going for many years, is key to some of this too. Users are changing too, aren't they? Perhaps most importantly, machines. It's not just about humans. The human in the loop for machines is probably the software writer. And that's a long way from the real life situation. New sectors are opening up using geospatial, or they probably don't know it's geospatial. And agriculture is the example I got on the slide here. The apps everywhere, absolutely. And how often do you have to write into your smartphone that you give permission for location to be used? The whole area of digital twins and smart cities and smart this and smart that, absolutely geospatial central. But again, there are new users too, and the whole finance industry, the finance sector, increasingly using geospatial for a range of things, in particular to try and predict commodity prices. And the users are getting younger, and they're looking for new things, they're looking for new solutions, they're looking for different things out of technology. And of course, they've grown up with technology in a way that I certainly have not. And expectations are changing. So we live in a world where data has driven much of what we do, and we've used automation to change data into information. But actually, artificial intelligence and other techniques and the developing web can help us create knowledge automatically. Knowledge that's needed by humans and by machines. And some of that knowledge is knowledge on demand. And people have written quite extensively about knowledge on demand. And of course, as we move up that pyramid, we're moving up the value chain. And it's quite interesting that I've got the figure somewhere. Here we are. The European Union estimates that nearly 6% of its GDP by 2025 will be driven by data, and that's an upward growth curve. So data turns to knowledge. Knowledge enables decision makings. It drives value. Now, we've had a very interesting journey over time in the digital world. We've gone from paper and desk phones, which I remember well, and we've gone up towards the right. And we're in the grey box now. We're in a world which I can't pretend to understand in detail, but there's a vast amount going on in that digital world. And in the geospatial world, we've also advanced rapidly, slightly separately at times, but we've gone from analog mapping through spatial data infrastructures, and we've built on that with the United Nations Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, which is advocating and helping nations achieve an integrated geospatial information management system. Now, why is all that important? Because we're still not joined with that wider digital world. And really what GKI is about, Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure, is trying to help us with that next step. Now, getting to this point, this summit is not the start of the journey. A group of partners has worked together for about a year now, trying to think through what this next step might mean. And it's drawn upon existing literature. It's drawn upon work that the United Nations has done. We produced a discussion paper back last summer that people have commented on. And there's been a whole series of round tables, of one-to-one discussions, bilateral discussions. And in fact, only last week, we had about 80 people at a round table from across Latin America discussing GKI. And what is clear amongst all of this, whilst there's differences in detail, what is absolutely clear is the need for us to try and have a new vision to drive geospatial closer to digitalization and 4IR is absolutely the right direction to be heading in. Now, as with anything, we have a series of a vision, a definition, some goals, and let me just take you through those. So in a sense, this defines the vision. It's straightforward, but you'll see it's about bringing geospatial knowledge and digital together, and indeed society. It's a very straightforward vision, but it's trying to power us to the future. There's a definition too, and the definition is not completely dissimilar. It's about integrating wider digital and geospatial approaches. It's aiming at knowledge, it's aiming at automation. And I would add, it's not an infrastructure in a traditional sense, it's more an infrastructure of infrastructures. Why would we invent something new when the web is hurtling in a certain direction? We need to make use of the direction that other infrastructures are heading in. And there are goals. There are 5 goals here, and I'll just summarize them. First of all, geolocated data is the norm, with the purpose of adding value. Secondly, foundation data, which includes the United Nations GGIM-defined fundamental geospatial data, is continuously updated and accessible to all. It's critical, and it should be part of a national infrastructure, and I'll come back to that. Thirdly, we need to bring the data and analytics communities closer together, to bring location to the heart of predictive modeling. Fourthly, users. We always talk about being user-focused, but users' needs are driving us to a much more collaborative, partnered environment and much more innovative. And by being collaborative, we can drive innovation. And fifthly, we need government policies to be optimized to enable all of this. So those are the goals. And in the paper, we have 6 elements. And the 6 elements are shown on this slide. And I'm just going to take us very briefly through each of those elements over the last 5 minutes. The first of those is an integrated government policy framework. Governments do have a major part to play in setting frameworks for anything really, but economic growth, social well-being, environmental protection being fundamental here. But the fourth industrial revolution is taking us to new policies and a new way of working. And what we need to do within governments is to bring digital thinking, space thinking, geospatial thinking. These policies need to be integrated in a way which perhaps they haven't been in the past. And geospatial data, geolocation, absolutely feature within discussions, for example, about privacy policy and so on and so forth. So we need more integrated digital policy setting, not standalone geospatial policies per se. And you'll see at the bottom of these slides, the bullets there are really some of the outcomes we're trying to achieve through each of the elements. And I'm not going to read them out to you. The second is a set of trusted and probably authoritative national data, which includes the fundamental geospatial data, but it's actually slightly wider because other data sets with location are equally important, and from weather through statistics, integration with statistics, absolutely critical, right the way through to national spatial plans. How is the infrastructure of a nation going to develop over time? These are all data sets with location that are part of the foundation data that a nation holds. But increasingly that foundation data, which is a scaffolding for the digital age, increasingly it needs to be continuously updated. There's no point in having 5-year-old data if with technology available now, with the sensors available now, we can actually have continuously updated data. Thirdly, partnerships and collaboration. And particularly, we've got to develop these in a way that sort of shares the costs and benefits across the value chain, because the value chain becomes more and more complex as we have partnerships. And we have no idea how data could be used to get value further downstream. So we need to think advance our thinking in the way of partnerships and collaboration. But it's also these partnerships and collaboration that will drive innovation, because quite often innovation happens at the boundaries between different industries. And that's where the disruption and innovation will come from, and therefore, hopefully, greater value, greater growth, greater investment. And also, we need to find a way, and will find a way, for industry and government to better collaborate, for example, on the creation of foundation data, because no longer is it a job for national geospatial agencies to create everything. When industry is creating much of it already, it's a matter of how we partner to bring that together and advance that geospatial information for the use of everyone. Industry, and it's really important that we do focus on industry here, because industry is actually driving much of the change. And we heard Stefan and Sanjay talk about some of those industries that are driving much of the change. No longer is government driving geospatial knowledge change. Industry very much is. And industry has a massive part to play in helping reach out into new sectors, in helping grow geospatial much more widely than it currently is. And in fact, many of those industries don't regard themselves as geospatial in the slightest. Geospatial is just part of their business process. It's part of what they do. And we need to be much closer as a geospatial community with wider industry and both ways. Applications, analytics and modeling. Knowledge comes from data. It comes from a good use case. It comes from the analytics, the modeling. Bring them all together and we start to have knowledge. So we cannot have a geospatial infrastructure of any sort that doesn't think about the cognition elements of it, if you like, the modeling elements. So that's why we are absolutely keen and have brought in applications, analytics and modeling into this. It's symbiotic, data and analytics symbiotic. And the sixth one is the geospatial dimension to the wider digital ecosystem. This is much more around geospatial being central to everything everyone does, whether they're individual companies and their business processes, whether it's the web and how geospatial technologies and standards are integrated into the web. So those are the 6 elements. The paper, when we publish it, then breaks these down into a set of initiatives and recommendations under each element. So I'm not going through them, I'm just introducing that idea that there are elements, but there's more detail as the paper is published. So that's it. That's a quick introduction to Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure. That's the vision on the slide there. We'll let you know when the white paper is published, and it'd be great to get your feedback and comments upon it when that happens. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John, for taking us through the presentation on Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure. So with this, I hand over the floor to Rob Vanderwill for a panel discussion on why GKI, setting the context. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the panel discussion. Who do we have as members of the panel? John Keeder, no further introduction. Greg Scott, United Nations. Albert Momo, Trimble. Paloma Merodia, the National Institute for Statistics and Geography in Mexico. Marie Wilson, Geoscience, Australia. And Peter Rapley, Place Fund, USA, a venture fund that invests in non-profit organizations. I'm Rob van der Velde. I'm a geographer, and I'm the director of GeoNovum, the Netherlands National Geospatial Standards Organization. Before raising my first question to the panel, I would like to share some of my thoughts. When I listened to Sanjay, Stefan, and John, the following questions came into my mind, and they deal with responsibility, with readiness. Are we ready as a geospatial ecosystem of policymakers, regulators, investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, technology providers, custodians of gigantic data spaces? Are we ready to fulfill our responsibility? Are we prepared enough? Prepared and ready for what? The next crisis. Today, precisely a year ago, in my country, the first coronavirus patient was determined. And also today, only 1 year later, 5% of the Dutch population has been vaccinated. Although we all, in the entire world, were overrun by this virus, the knowledge infrastructure was ready and in place. The pharmaceutical and biomedical knowledge infrastructure has shown to be ready to fight a crisis. And we all hope that the entire population of the world will be vaccinated as soon as possible. But they were there. The knowledge infrastructure of our colleagues from other disciplines, they were there. And we have been warned, and I'm very happy that Stefan and also John started their talks with climate change. We have been warned by renowned experts inside our own community that the next crisis will be the climate crisis. According to our colleagues from the UN, from IPCC, from NOAA, from EPA, USGS, some of them are today in this call, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, European Environmental Agency, Geoscience Australia. They have warned us that the impact of the climate crisis will be much, much bigger than the corona crisis. So will the adoption of this concept and the strategies of the geospatial knowledge infrastructure really make us more ready, better prepared to fight the next crisis? A lot of questions. And do we have any beginnings of the answers? So that's just for this introduction. I will start with you, Albert. The fourth industrial revolution is presented by John and in the video as the ecosystem that triggers the GKI. So one could argue that the industry is in the driver's seat because it's the industry who has the power to develop the technology. So what about the geospatial industry? Does it take its role enough? Is it leading or following in the creation of a GKI? Albert.
Yes, thank you, Rob. My answer will be very simple. I think the geospatial industry is leading because of all the innovation that we are putting in place, that we are working on. But even though the geospatial industry is leading, the geospatial industries really need the partnership with the government, with international organizations, in order to bring GKI to the broad public. So my answer is really simple. Yes, the geospatial industry is leading, but the geospatial industry is really willing to partner with others in order to make GKI something for everyone.
Albert, you say that you need partnership. What is your, let's say, example of where you see that partnership is successful? In which area or which domain? Where are you? Where are we going?
So the geospatial industry has to take advantage of existing models in, for example, public-private partnership that exist in the infrastructure industry or now more and more in the land industry, where we can provide solutions to our users, but working with the government. So I can see some progress in the use of geospatial data in satellite data, where more and more innovation is coming from the geospatial industry, but the respective governments are actually tapping into the resources of the industry in order to either develop some specific tools for the general public, or in order to someone mentioned what just happened in India. So the government is opening itself to use of geospatial data, geospatial technology coming from industry, and having the government as a facilitator. So that's where the success is for me.
Okay, thank you. I go to you, Greg. You have been a key contributor to the GKI with the integrated geospatial framework. My question for you is: does this technology advancement does it really trickle down to the needs of societies? What is your story about this trickling down of all the benefits of technology, and what is key to accelerate this process? So what is your view on trickling down and acceleration of the use of technology?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, the trickle effect. I think it's really interesting as we reflect on where we are today, and we think about the challenges that we've all had to endure over the last year or so. But I guess now, as we think more about sustainability, and I talk about sustainability more broadly, whether it's climate or disasters or health or poverty, etc., is that I guess part of the challenge that we've had, I would argue, for quite a few years now, has been the lack of awareness around the role that geospatial information and the geospatial industry plays in this broader industry revolution, if we can call it that, and in this change, in this digital disruption and digital transformation and all of the buzzwords that go with it. And so, we were seen in the UN and GGIM, where a lot of our work is focused on developing countries and some of the least developed countries in the world. And you could just see this huge divide and this huge gap, not only a digital divide, but a geospatial digital divide. And it was just growing and growing. And so there's sort of two things that have catalyzed some of that change. 4 years ago, literally almost to the day, we started a journey on the integrated geospatial information framework. It was really about it was really about trying to make a change, bring about a change, changing the language, changing the emphasis and the need on where geospatial information fits, where it's no more just about a spatial data infrastructure. It's bigger than that. It's broader than that. It needs to engage more with governments and institutions and these sorts of things. It's really important, and particularly in developing countries. You know, why is geospatial important? What can we do about it? How do we implement a national framework, and how do we enable countries to leverage geospatial information? So that was really the core around some of that journey 4 years ago. 2 years ago, we started with the GKI, and the IGIF was focused more around governments, national needs for geospatial agencies, environment agencies, cadastre, land administration, etc. It was really focused at that. But in the background, we keep getting, you know, the technology and innovation thread coming in. And so how do we engage more with technology? How does technology, all this disruptor and innovation, change what we do? And the challenge we've had in our geospatial industry is that we're really, and we know this, we're really good at talking to ourselves, with ourselves. And the GKI was fundamentally, and it is fundamentally, an attempt to engage more with the digital economy, with the community and the broader industry of where geospatial or location plays a role, but it's not necessarily a primary role or even a recognized role. And it's saying, how do we actually expand the relevance of location and the awareness of how geospatial data is being used or not used, and appropriately or not, into that broader industry process. And the GKI is the mechanism that is to do just that.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Perhaps we will come back on one of your statements later. I'll go to Marie. My question for you, it's your background to know a lot about the resources on Earth. What do you think now, currently? How capable, how ready are we to monitor the Earth's resources? And what do you expect from this GKI strategy for the next couple of years? How far are we, and what are your expectations?
I have very high expectations. Similar to what Greg was saying, I feel like we've been talking about this integration for decades amongst ourselves. So I'm very keen to see it, taken further into the integrators. I guess my challenge around the GKI is around the geospatial literacy of our integrators. So the demand is there for accurate data, be it resource data, any sort of geospatial data. They're wanting better accuracy in their data. But then the integrators don't understand things like datums. So we're told that our data is terrible because it doesn't line up with what they were using, and so they don't use it, even though we have created highly accurate open data for that use. So I guess that's my challenge on the GKI, is how do we raise that geospatial data literacy in those integrators so we can really embed ourselves as part of the fourth industrial revolution.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to you, Paloma. We know you all as a key advisor to the Mexican government. And I was wondering, we are wondering, how do you communicate to let's say, to the leadership in your country on the reasons and the advantages of a GKI? What kind of words, what kind of language? And is there anything which you know now from GKI you are missing, which could be more helpful to communicate the message?
Okay, thank you, Rob, and good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone. Thank you for the invitation to share our perspective. And well, I'm not an advisor. I'm vice president of INEGI, which is an autonomous entity of the national of the Mexican government and the National Institute of Statistics and Geography. And I think your question goes directly to what I wanted to share in terms of how do we communicate with the leadership about these important measures and these important topics. And also to your initial question about is this the right time? And I think that, I mean, you had you showed us a kind of positive positive scenario where you say 1 year ago when it all started, we were getting vaccinated, but this is not the case in the developing world. I mean, in Mexico, not even the medical personnel had been vaccinated. And I don't think that we will be vaccinated this year, I mean, in the entire population. It's been a year without schools. Kids are in the houses. It's been 1 year that children cannot go to schools. Unemployment is rising. And we're expecting 10 million more people that will be in poverty. So is this the right time? And with these issues, how do we communicate to our leadership that this is important? I mean, if I talk about digital thinking, data analytics, artificial intelligence, that sounds so fancy, but how does that impact our people? How does that help unemployment, poverty, and all these issues that governments really need to face? And one example is I'm working with the Marine and our Foreign Affairs Ministry to have an ocean hub. And we've been working for a year to have an ocean platform with all the information we've done, diagnosis about what kind of data do we have, how can we put it together, how can we partner with private sector to have this hub up, and that we provide all the information needed for the high level panel on ocean sustainability. But I mean, people are, the Foreign Affairs Ministry is looking for vaccines, and that's the only thing that they're looking at now. So how can we really show that these kind of examples, I mean, we talked about climate change. Of course, we want a platform where we can get all the data about the ocean so we can plan, but that's not a priority for our governments now. And we really, when we're talking about these issues, we really need to think, how can we provide access to these geospatial technologies to the developing world? I mean, how, as Greg mentioned, how can we make this geospatial divide not to be bigger with the context that we're living now? I understand that all of this is important, but we really need to see how to implement this in the developing world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter, you are the last one in this round. Could you please give us your perspective, and also maybe you could respond to what Paloma said about of course there is a big divide in the world, and Greg also mentioned that. How could that also help us to get priorities on the right place? So please give your thoughts on what you expect from a global movement like GKI wants to be.
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, good evening, afternoon, everyone. And Sanjay and team, thanks for having me. And so with the risk of being the curmudgeon in the room, if you will, I think what Paloma said really resonated. I think our biggest concern is this rapidly growing digital divide. Speaking with many of my African government partners, they actually refer to what's happening with technology as a form of colonialism, just a new wave, a new form of colonization. And that divide is going to accelerate regardless. There's nothing we can do about it. Private platforms like Google and Facebook are able to leverage network effects and have the scale that not even the most advanced governments can actually leverage. And we're seeing some of that play out in Australia, even just around news, and how much of a fight is really underway between private platforms, their data collection and aggregation power versus public interest. I think where I struggle, and I did enjoy reading what the team sent me, and I think it's a comprehensive overview, but I don't see what it is as a product, and of course that is my bias, and how this framework really helps entities, not just governments, national governments that are being left behind, but how does this really help organizations, companies, and the people themselves? And I always try and apply it through that lens. It does feel, as you know, as a framing and as an intellectual sort of dialogue, very, very helpful in terms of if you want to understand what a complete landscape would look like. But actually, how does it translate into helping local entities and local people with this massively accelerating digital divide? And of course, I can pose a question, and I can be the annoying one who poses a question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I think, you know, when I read this, that's my struggle.
Okay.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your open and also very constructive question, because I think many of us will have this question. So let's put this question on the table. John, start with you, because you did an awful lot of excellent work in bringing all these concepts together and also trying to put it in a sort of strategy. Could you please respond first to this? How could it be, let's say, be made more practical, more product-like, whatever you call it, for entities in the world, in parts of the world?
Yeah, and actually, the view that Paloma and Peter have put is something that's been, I think, at the back of everyone's mind through this year. And I don't think we're there yet. I mean, we've tried to bring into the thinking more in terms of what needs to happen as opposed to what the intellectual debate is. But I think the challenge is, how do we then take it into particularly developing nations? I do think, though, that there are opportunities driven by the technological changes. So, you know, I'll just quote one at the moment. I won't mention the company name, but it's a partnership between companies collecting data from space and using AI in order to create geospatial data of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the key then is, how do we make that data available to the countries in sub-Saharan Africa to use? But that's how the innovation, the technology piece, can perhaps drive new data much more cheaply and get it into, again, potentially, if we get it right, get it into nations. The second example I'll use is, I was very taken by a discussion we had, an African regional discussion actually, and the discussion was very much around, how do we partner as countries, a group of countries, to try and generate more innovation from our startup businesses? You know, for example, how do we can't do it as an individual nation, but how can we get industry and governments to partner potentially on a regional basis? So it's not that there aren't some solutions out there. I just don't think it's, you know, I completely concur. It's, you know, we're fighting a tidal wave of a growing digital divide, and you know, we will try, and we continue to try in the paper, and the white paper does try and take it further, to come up with the recommendations, as opposed to sort of keeping it up in the ether.
Okay, thank you. I will give the floor to all of you to give your second thought or to respond on what your colleagues put forward. Who would like to say something? Sanjay.
So what Peter talked about, and I heard every panelist, and I wanted to just clarify one thing, is that the whole objective of this collaborative approach to develop GKI concept is to advance the role of geospatial knowledge in the economy, society, and environment. So it's a kind of evangelism role. What we are trying to do is to bring different kind of stakeholders, which is the as a geospatial professionals, at the same time opening and broadening the consultation process with the mainstream IT and engineering companies as well. So our intention is to basically provide a kind of more holistic, comprehensive approach to geospatial knowledge and its services. At the same time, also to bridge the gap between various communities and kind of break those silos. And what we are doing is part one is to develop the concept, and then second tier of the part will be to go to 10 to 15 countries and work with the governments to develop some kind of GKI strategy at the local level. And in that process, we'll be also educating and engaging with the political leadership. So our role is more of a kind of advancing the role of geospatial knowledge rather than coming up with a kind of platform or a kind of whole a system per se.
Okay, thank you. Yep. I saw Albert, you wanted to say something to one or to respond to one of your colleagues?
Yes, I want to give an industry's perspective to the debate on geospatial divide. I understand people may see that as a challenge, and for me, it's actually an opportunity. And like the developing countries, they're embracing the fourth revolution that we are mentioning. They're embracing geospatial, and they don't have to go through every steps other countries where have to go to. And now also some of the innovations that we're putting out there are actually allowing developing countries to get into the bandwagon faster than they would have done in the past. Now we're talking about hardware as a service. So that means you don't have to invest in hardware. We're talking about data as a service. You don't have to invest in getting all those data. And we all know data from the European satellite, from NASA satellite are open access to everyone, including those developing countries. We are now even talking about platform as a service. So we have a lot of tools that the industry put in place for developing countries actually to bridge that gap. But there is not. For me, it's more an opportunity than it is a challenge.
So you say developing as an advantage. Paloma, how does that reflect to what you said before?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, every day there's more and more open source and also access to all of these technologies. So listening to the conversation, I was going to say, well, suppose we get the attention of the leaders and they are really committed to this. Now we really need to think about how we're going to fund these activities, and also how are we going to bring capacity. We need to train our personnel, we need to train our agencies, and we need to get them involved in these technologies, because it's not only like, hey, here's your platform, here's your satellites, and then I leave and you'll see how you use them, right? So we really need agencies to internalize the work on geospatial and to be able for them to have the capacity to use in their own products these kind of technologies.
Okay, thank you. Time is very short now. So I have 30 seconds for Greg, for Peter, and for Marie to give your final thoughts. 30 seconds, Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to say one comment around, as we've evolved in the development agendas over the last 20 or so, 30 odd years, is that whilst we have many, many challenges in front of us, it's incumbent on us, whether we talk about development or not, it's incumbent on us to actually, make attempts to make change. And I think we're making that change.
Okay, Peter?
Let's keep going. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks. I agree with Albert that opportunity is there, and any good business will see opportunity and solve it. I think the challenge fundamentally is, and I would love to see more of this in the document, Greg and John, is the nature of what is in public interest. What is a public good? Because the fundamental nature of a public good has shifted drastically.
Okay.
And so I have, in my conversations with public officials, they say, I don't need to fund this anymore. The private sector makes it available.
Thank you.
And so there's a complete moving away from what is in the public interest and a public good. And while the European satellites may be open now and in the foreseeable future, what if they're not? Yeah. And you've built an entire structure around something you have assumed. So I think... Yeah. And you don't make a strong enough argument, in my perspective, for that fundamental position.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Finally, Marie.
just very quickly, I guess we've seen examples where governments have really embraced geospatial and it's fundamental to their entire organization. So we've got some great examples out there that we can absolutely use across the world. So I guess as far as that advocacy for our own industry, I think it's there and we just have to take it forward, and good luck.
Okay. Thank you all, panel. Time's up. Hope you all enjoyed it. Also the viewers, and keep up the good work. Bye-bye.
I'd like to welcome everyone to session 1 in this Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure Summit today, which I believe is a very important event for addressing a critical issue that we're facing as we go forward. And if you look at the events recently relating to the pandemic, we have a number of challenges and opportunities that we're facing that makes this discussion today and tomorrow even more important. If you look at issues relating to climate change, urbanization, and the potential for disruptions, unexpected or even expected disruptions in society, we realize why the concept of GKI is so critical to our future around the world. A few introductory comments that I'd like to make just as we begin. The revolution we're facing, the fourth industrial revolution, encompasses changes in data and technology and synthesis that were unbelievable compared to what happened just in the recent past. I looked at some of the statistics that are included in our white paper, and the estimate is that the volume of data that is available quadruples every 5 years. And then there's an estimate that the value of that data is going to be approximately 5.8% in the European Union in just 4 years from now, 2025. And that's a huge amount when you start thinking about it from a global perspective. I invite you to think back just 100 years ago, 1921, and to imagine where we would be in the world today if we had the geospatial infrastructure of 1921 to address our problems today. Even more recently, if you go back to the change in the millennium, to the year 2000, a time that many of us were in the workforce and understood geospatial data back then and geospatial knowledge, and think of where we were at the change of the millennium and try to imagine if we had to go back to our situation then to address the world's problems, where we would be. And that gives us, it gives us an opportunity to think forward, to look at situations where in 20 years, what are some of the potential benefits that we can have, some of the potential changes? They're huge here. And so I think the opportunity that we have is large. I think that to some extent, the challenges that we face are humbling, and we do have to consider that as we go forward. And that's the reason that I think the discussion today and tomorrow are so important. We have 4 outstanding panelists today who are going to share their perspectives from very different types of organizations, from different locations in the world. And I think that they're going to set the stage for our understanding of geospatial platforms and services that are ready for the fourth industrial revolution. But it also gives us a perspective for considering the opportunities and challenges relating to GKI as we go forward. To start the discussion, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mark Corver, who is the worldwide tech leader for geospatial with Amazon Web Services, USA. Mark, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Good morning from Seattle, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I wanted to quickly go over 4 different topics today. AWS's cloud locations and region design. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what the cloud means and what's at your disposal in terms of platform or infrastructure services for geospatial. I just have a little bit I wanted to speak to you about sustainable compute and how the cloud is part of the solution to that. Also, speak a little bit about the many cloud services you have at your fingertips. And lastly, and it'll just be for like 30 seconds, but I wanted to introduce our very first location service. So first of all, I apologize for the map. I know that Greenland isn't that large, but this is kind of the first view of Amazon Web Services regional expansion. So the first 5 years, there were 4 regions. When I started as a customer before I joined AWS, there was just Northern Virginia many, many years ago. It's over 10 years ago now. And then in the next 5 years, that grew to additional 7 regions. And you can see expansion in places like Sydney and Tokyo. I was happy when Tokyo came online because I'm born and raised in Tokyo. So that was exciting personally for me. And then the next slide here is basically speaks to the acceleration of regions. So between 2016 and 2020, we added 13 regions and 1 local region, and then we announced 6 additional regions. And so this is, this is the view today. And, the main thing here is anybody with a credit card that has access to the cloud, the AWS cloud, can deploy in Oregon as easily as they can deploy in Tokyo. So the main takeaway here is that, assuming you have access to vendor-supplied software or open source software, anybody can deploy in any part of the world and provide services to many different populations in a way that wasn't possible before. So now we have 24 geographical regions and announced regions. I'll skip this. Another important consideration is that I'm talking about 24 regions, but each one of these regions actually contains multiple data centers. So typically 3 data centers. So it's actually 3 times 24, and so you have access to not just regions, but within the context of regions, multiple what we call availability zones. You can think of them as data centers. And on top of that, we have what's called CloudFront, which is our content distribution network, which adds another over 200 different edge locations to get your geospatial content to your customer even more quickly than just from our regions. And of course, we have private networks and the ability, for example, if you're an enterprise customer with a data center, you can make a connection to one of 80 plus locations, and then all of a sudden you have access to this global network that connects regions. So just a few years ago, this was not available to somebody with a credit card. And the next part here is Amazon is actually the first signatory to the climate pledge. And so we've committed to 100% net zero carbon by 2040, 80% renewable energy by 2024, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason we're confident we can do these kinds of things at this kind of scale is because we're making heavy investment in wind and solar energy. You may have heard that we have committed to buy, tens of thousands of electric vehicles for delivery and so on. And the other part of this is that we're the public cloud, because we typically run server populations that are 3.6 times more energy efficient than a typical US enterprise data center. In combination with our server utilization, because our servers are shared, are much higher. So we're much more efficient. So in a combination of investing in wind and solar energy, so what powers the data centers are more sustainable, and in the fact that because you're in shared infrastructure, the CPUs and all, everything that supports those infrastructure is being used at a much higher efficiency. So we have many products. I won't go into them all, of course, because there's over 200. But if you just look at, for example, the upper left-hand corner is analytics, and open that up, you'll see that we have a number of different services that allow you to run analytics. And I've circled the ones in green because they specifically have geospatial capability. All of these services, in one way or another, can map to geospatial, but these specifically do. And there are many others also. Here's an example. This is NASA Cumulus documentation. So the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This project is about moving NASA distributed active archives called DACs. So imagine many NASA data centers, large data centers, moving to the cloud. This documentation documents open source Cumulus project, which you have access to. And in this picture, you can clearly see that NASA is using AWS to innovate, build these systems in the cloud. These are AWS icons that you see in this picture. Another example is ESRI, ArcGIS Online, runs in the cloud, runs on AWS. And then lastly, I wanted to briefly introduce Amazon Location Service. So this is our very first location service, first quote-unquote mappy thing that we've done, announced just recently and currently in preview. This is a little bit of the web console, the management console. You'll see that we have maps, place indexes, geofence collections, and trackers. And before general availability, we expect to provide a routing API also. And probably the most important aspect of this is that it's Amazon location in the center there, but we're providing access to high quality data from providers such as ASRI, and here and going forward, you can expect more. So the general concept here is with a consistent API, you can, for example, provide global maps from multiple vendors, and you could do things like change the map as a function of where your customer using their smartphone is right now, which was previously not available, not at a global scale. So this is very new, and of course you pay as you use it. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
In this new world that we're entering into, our second speaker on this today is Huang Zhongwen, who is the director of the Digital Planning Lab in the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore. Huang, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Carl, and good day to see everyone in different parts of the world. I remembered some discussion on GKI just several months ago when we were discussing this in this region. And I think today's discussion is quite interesting in several ways. So I'm from URA, which is the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and we are the National Land Use Planning Authority in Singapore. In Singapore, the use of geospatial technology and data is something that we have been actively working on for quite a number of years. And I think when we look at the way we do planning in the digital age, the fundamentals of why we do urban planning has remained very evergreen and constant. But the art and science of how we do it has changed significantly. I think in relation to the discussion today on GKI, I think how essentially do we see the use of geospatial technology and data for planning? It allows us to firstly have a much better grasp of what is the situation on the ground that we are planning for or dealing with. It helps us to have a better understanding of why certain things are happening, and in relation to what was also discussed earlier, a way to make sense of how things could potentially pan out in the future. Urban planning is not always just about dealing with the issues of today, but how do we enable ourselves to prepare and create a better future for our people and to support the needs of the economy as it evolves in the future. And I think the use of data is a very good way, where it allows us, and especially with geospatial data, to have a more common picture of what is the situation that we are dealing with. It allows the way we plan, the process, to be a lot more responsive, to be a lot more efficient, And in terms of the solutions, whether it's solutions in providing social facilities or solutions in meeting the needs of the businesses, it allows a lot of these decisions to be more precise and a lot more targeted. I think what's common in many cities, including Singapore, is that we are facing increasing needs, but we also have increasingly constrained in terms of resources. So we got to be a lot more targeted in what do we invest in public infrastructure, and also where do we develop different kind of facilities. I think the efforts that we made in maybe what we used to call the new normal pre-COVID, in really working with data, developing digital tools, having planners who have been constantly looking at how do we transform the way we do planning and urban design. I think it came in very handy during COVID, where the ability to understand and the ability to have some of this geospatial data as a foundation allowed us to then very quickly piece together information that we needed to organize our efforts, whether it's in terms of addressing some of the residential and housing situation, or even providing people with better and more timely information on the crowd levels in our retail amenities. And I think this is really a case where what we do in normal times comes in handy during times of crisis. But nonetheless, I think there are still quite a few challenges that I feel is relevant in this broader discussion on GKI. Firstly, from a planning agency, we deal with many domains of the urban systems. And in many different urban systems, it is therefore very natural that we are having to deal with data in various scales, in various forms. And when we talk about data at different scale, it could be as small as a premise, a unit level information. It go up to a building, to the site, to the neighborhood and district, up to the region. And therefore, in terms of looking at how do we capture data, how do we model and represent the real world well, we need to be able to deal with information across scales. And because planning is not just about looking at the present, we look at trends from the past, we gauge what is the situation at present, we also try to forecast and project the future. And therefore, when we think about geospatial information, we also need to look at both time and space to be able to allow us to do various types of analysis. And because there are many stakeholders involved in the entire urban system, it also requires us to deal with data in various formats, whether it's geospatial, CAD, tabular, in text. And there needs to be a way to bring data from various sources which are fit for purpose for who has created or acquired the data. But in the effort of trying to bring it together, it can be quite challenging, and it requires quite a bit of effort. Effort in terms of not just the conversion and the cleaning, but also effort in convincing the stakeholders that it is worthwhile to make the data available. I think, Carl, you mentioned earlier about the increase in the amount of data and the value that data can unlock. But data is not just about the value. Data is also cost. It costs resources to collect the data, to clean and prepare the data, manage the data. And when the data is also owned by different stakeholders, there are concerns pertaining to risks and liabilities that comes with the quality of the data. And therefore, in thinking about this question of data, not just as the resource, but also what comes associated with it in terms of the resource and liabilities, it then requires a very dedicated effort to think about how do we address the concerns of the different stakeholders? How do we ensure that stakeholders can see value in improving the data quality, sharing the data, and continuing to make the data available and to the wider ecosystem? And I feel that that's something that's quite important as we think about, in particularly, this question of what are the governance and operational frameworks that we should have in place. Frameworks that allows us to manage the risk and the cost. It allows us to achieve more interoperability in the data, and also build partnerships and build alignment in terms of what we want to achieve together. Looking ahead, I feel there are a few things we are also starting to think about. I think in this larger effort of GKI, I think that the word K pertaining to the knowledge is really a very important aspect. I think when we look at geospatial data, I think we are not just talking about the data. It is itself also a kind of digital infrastructure in how we capture, manage, store knowledge itself. And there's a significant amount of knowledge. And from a planning and a more policy-related field that we do, there's a lot of knowledge in textual information, a lot of information that is today in various documents, and we need a better way to be able to extract out the information that exists in these documents. I think the advancements in natural language processing opens up a lot of possibilities for us to extract out information. But how do we bring the information into a form that we can map, we can do spatial analysis on? And that's not so easy. And because that requires us to be able to do georeferencing of the information from this text. And I think that requires a much better data infrastructure. Data infrastructure or gazetteer that better captures names of places. Names of places that are formal, that are administrative, transactional, or even informal names that people may have, because these could be the very names that appear in the documents. And we need to also have a way to deal with these names across time, because some names may be more used during a certain period of time, and it may change. And when we are extracting textual information, which will span many, many years, if we are not able to properly georeference this information, it will also become quite an issue. So how do we do that? I feel it will be one important aspect. I think last but not least, I think in our effort through COVID, we have been very active in looking at what are the kind of geospatial information we should make available to the public. And in particular, one example is our effort in providing, I mentioned, near real-time crowd level information, so that we've been trying to achieve better safe distancing. We are able to advise people on where are the crowded places they may want to avoid at certain times of the day. But one of the feedback we received is that in this effort of providing geospatial information and geospatial applications, how do we also make it inclusive? Inclusive such that, for example, people with visual disabilities, are they able to view the information on the map in a very easy way, to be able to have clear distinction such that information that we present that may look easy for people without any disabilities to view, it may not be so straightforward for people who have problems distinguishing certain colors, or that they are quite impaired in even being able to see the images on the map. And for some of them, they are relying on screen readers. So when we talk about using geospatial applications, are there certain standards that we should have such that it becomes much more inclusive and accessible for people with such disabilities to use screen readers to access the information? So these are some quick thoughts from the experiences we have. Thanks.
Thank you for very important remarks. I think your points about making our geospatial data and knowledge more inclusive and more ready for multiple audiences is a really key point that you're making. I very much appreciate your mentioning the fact that when we look at the value of data and technology and knowledge more broadly, we're not just considering benefits. There are costs to be considered and methods of making those data available and that knowledge available to broad audiences. Our next speaker is Catherine Armour, who is the director of the customer division in the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office in the United Kingdom. Catherine, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Carl. I appreciate you having me here today, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us. I just wanted to start off, first of all, I think when we talk about geospatial data, we often talk about the terrestrial environment, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the importance of marine geospatial data. So it's a common solution to many of the challenges we face, particularly concerning the marine environment. And the data can provide insight to ecosystems, industries, resources, and communities. We're seeing that data being used across multiple sectors, from marine genetic resources, disaster resilience and relief, marine conservation, ecosystem services, seabed minerals, coastal tourism, ocean-based renewables, marine finance and insurance, and I could go on. Our more traditional space, of course, is in maritime navigation. But sustainable development for our IR advances is particularly important to us at UK Hydrographic Office, and that's where we're focusing on advancing our data efforts. So marine geospatial data and sustainable use of our oceans can enable decision makers to harness offshore renewable energy, predict the impacts of extreme weather events, develop habitat maps to monitor and mitigate the effects of climate change. And all of those activities are enabled by fourth industrial revolution technologies. We also want to make sure that we're enabling blue economic growth. It's particularly important. We know that there will be a need for an economic recovery after we emerge from the challenges of 2020. And that same data can be used for things such as undersea cable laying, land reclamation projects, fishing policies, and aquaculture development in a sustainable way. So the UKHO holds petabytes of marine geospatial data to support a breadth of ocean industries across the globe. So specifically now I want to talk about what I consider 4 key areas that we need to address, and the 3 shared pillars of success. So those 4 key areas are innovation, autonomous navigation, digitalization and connectivity, and then public-private partnerships. And the shared pillars for success across those are collaboration, promoting the use of accurate, trusted geospatial data across ocean communities, accessibility, providing access to data through data platforms so decision makers can unlock its value, and global reach, so supporting international programs such as this one to support data collection efforts and capacity building. Now, our raison d'etre, our purpose, is safe, secure and thriving oceans. So both the 4 key areas and the approach, the 3 shared pillars are critical to us. So let me dive a little bit into those. Innovation. So the digital revolution in the past decade has seen an explosion in the depth and breadth of marine geospatial data. As I said, we process petabytes of that marine geospatial data, but we're also assured that we need that data to find the solutions to protect the marine environment and unlock the power of the blue economy, as I've just said. We're looking at various initiatives from computer visioning techniques to understand coastal erosion, to using machine learning to plot changes to the global population of mangroves. And in the way that offshore construction is undertaken, navies and coast guards provide security. The seabed is surveyed, freight's moved around, and people are transported. All have scope for massive change if we improve propulsion technologies, energy storage, sensors, communication, artificial intelligence, processing, and system integration. And underpinning that is the marine geospatial data. The marine geospatial data digital revolution, though I'm sad to say, has yet to be massively adopted across the shipping sector, as we're still working almost the same way that we used to, but electronically. So the next step is to enable the sector to embrace a genuine digital revolution. That will require advances in offshore and open ocean satellite communications, decreased cost of adoption, and increased availability of quality assured real-time data sources. So a key advance, an area that we need to support, is autonomous navigation. And that's a key opportunity for the blue economy, not just for maritime transport. The technology available to the maritime world is changing fast, and the impacts of new technology are widespread and deep. So as I say, it's the integration and development of these technologies, propulsion, energy storage, sensors, communication, AI, processing and system integration, that will allow for reduced manning on onboard vessels, unmanned workboats, unmanned security platforms, and eventually unmanned large ships. Facilitating greater access to previously unattainable data on the oceans and the ocean environment for more sustainable decision making. It's not just the maritime transport sector that is waiting for autonomous vessels, it's particularly the data collect that will be enabled through these unmanned vessels, giving us deeper access and broader access to oceans that haven't been surveyed previously. So smart vessels can create a digital world model, they can calculate potential routes, assign risks, and make decisions on safe navigational routes ahead that abide by collision regulations, but also move us towards that end goal. But safety is critical, and reliable, quality assured data and data standards is an imperative to ensure safe navigation. New technology, though, brings new challenges, and as a result, we believe that autonomy needs to raise its game. At the moment, there's a big interest in autonomous vessels, how they position themselves. It's widely known across the industry that there are vulnerabilities with GPS. On digital twinning, we are particularly interested in projects that create digital twins for the maritime space. Just imagine the power of a global ocean digital twin. Recently, we've looked at sedimentary, intertidal areas and total data as to how we create visible seabed and how light penetrates through water. We could see, for example, off the coast of Southampton that there's a lot of silt and organic content in the water, and that's why it always looks muddy. Whereas in the middle of the Caribbean, these levels are different, and that's why the water looks clear. Now, that might seem very simple, but that's really important from a simulation perspective and from taking decisions around establishing offshore infrastructure and how we manage coastal marine environments. So now I want to move to the third theme, which is digitalization and connectivity. So as I've touched on, maritime missed out in the first wave of digitalization due to lack of good connectivity. And as an industry, we need to ensure that this isn't the case with the fourth industrial revolution. Although connectivity on certain vessels, especially if they're cruise ships or passenger ships, can be better than others, it's fair to say that connectivity on board most vessels is poor. Technologies such as Starlink and 5G can actually substantially improve and change connectivity on board and have a massive impact on data supply and live up-to-the-minute data. The challenge is not limited to communication and access to data, but as I've said, the collection of real-time data. And then just finally, I want to talk about government and private sector and public-private relationships and partnerships. The challenge for governments is enabling the access to geospatial data from private entities who are not traditional providers of data, encouraging them to share data and realizing its value for decision making. So how does government adapt to adoption of wider geospatial, and how are governments ready to scale up in this space? Geospatial data used to come from government and be pushed out to people in what effectively was very unidirectional push. 10 to 20 years ago, for example, the major geospatial player in the UK was Ordnance Survey. Now providers have shifted, and it's digital players that dominate this sector: Google, Facebook, and we've heard from Amazon. Geospatial data has become about feedback mechanisms from IoT devices and mobile data gathering. One of the things that changed is the ownership of geospatial data. Public entities used to have all of that data, and now it's private entities that hold it. There's a challenge there if we're able to have data equity and apply fair data principles, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable. So the revolution in the geospatial tooling space is effectively a significant opportunity for the growing adoption of geospatial data for critical decision making, where different players from cloud, open source, Esri, Amazon Ware will take center stage and expand the possibilities of the industry. But the wider challenge for the industry is the adoption and use of geospatial data beyond the sector and traditional users, understanding and promoting new use cases, and providing tools and models that enable access and simplify adoption by non-data experts, such as the APIs and web mapping services. The question isn't about how we get geospatial data to people already within the sector. We've solved that problem. The question is about how we can get geospatial data more widely used outside of the sector. And the challenge is to present this data in a way that anyone outside of the industry can use it and understand it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Catherine. I think you've given us a good service with the connection of this topic to marine geospatial data and more broadly, the blue economy. how does GKI relate to the blue economy is an important question for us to be considering and to move into. Our final speaker on this panel is Tyler Dahlberg, who is a geodata scientist at Booking.com, and he's based out of the Netherlands. Tyler, we look forward to hearing your remarks.
So I was saying that so travel is one of the most spatial things we do, whether it's about sort of where we're going or how we're getting there. So how can we meet the new challenges of travel in this sort of current COVID and post-COVID world with advances in technology? So what do smart devices have to do with travel? So I think that the Internet of Things in particular can make travel less foreign and more familiar. I think the same kind of comforts that we imagine for ourselves at home, customizable light settings, a thermostat that automatically adjusts to the temperature that you like. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be able to bring those things with us on the road someday, so that when you go somewhere, it feels a little bit more familiar. I also think that things like checking in, especially to homestays, can be a really high friction experience, especially with regards to key handoff. I remember once I was staying at a homestay in Brooklyn, and I had to meet somebody in Midtown Manhattan in order to pick up the keys at some point in the afternoon. And these places were about an hour apart. It was incredibly inconvenient. And if this is a friction for me, it's probably a friction for a lot of people as well. I think that this also represents a huge opportunity for hoteliers and property managers to glean a lot more information from their guests in ways that can improve the guest experience. So for instance, if you're a large hotel with multiple lobbies, finding out which ones are more popular based on who's there, the Wi-Fi signal traffic at the time. And I think an interesting thing that could be done with the Internet of Things and smart devices would be, if you have a tendency to set all the temperatures in your building at a certain level, basically, maybe we could learn that people generally like the temperature lower. And so maybe we could set it to an energy saving level. But I think there are a lot of challenges with the Internet of Things. I think new tech equals new headaches. There are a lot of sort of privacy concerns with regards to smart devices. It's kind of it means more surveillance. It means more entry points for attacks or security risks. And I think a really big challenge also is, can we make sense of all the data? I think this is something that a few people mentioned before, but like data formats, are these things interoperable? Like, is the metadata that's generated by a Hue light bulb the same as an IKEA light bulb? I doubt it, but and can we zoom out from there and actually sort of gain insights from these mountains of information that are going to be generated from all these things? But I'd like to move on to sort of like my main discussion point, which is more about the fourth industrial revolution. So could we advance? So how else is technology changing? So I think Mark touched on this with the advances in things like AWS and all the tooling across the whole technology ecosystem. Machine learning is becoming more available and easier to use. Distributed computing is becoming cheaper and easier than ever. Cloud services are becoming the norm, whether you're aware of it or not. When you take pictures on your phone, you're probably uploading things to the cloud. There are more and better open source tools now. There are whole companies built on open source, and they open source what they produce. And collaboration tools are advancing rapidly. I mean, this platform that we're using right now is something that didn't exist a few years ago. So this is a huge advance as well. And I think that technology is actually catching up somewhat to the scale and complexity of geoproblems. Even without a good spatial database, you can throw a bunch of computing cores at something and solve really heavy problems like distance calculations from a data set with 1 million things to another data set with a few million things, stuff that was really unheard of on a lone computer. We have cheap storage in the cloud, which means that we can do things like copy the entirety of OpenStreetMap and put it in some database. Mark was talking about how we're moving petabytes of satellite data from satellite agencies. And faster computers in general mean that we have access to better and more interactive visualizations than we ever had before. Things like Kepler GL, Tableau visualizations, ArcMap, Mapbox, Google Maps is now sort of a 3D vector. Like our computers wouldn't have been able to handle these things a decade ago. And really the advances in miniaturization and speed in our computers really help these things along. And machine learning, of course, can take advantage of all of these things as well. But I think here comes my controversial statement. Next slide, please. I don't know if you've heard this before, this phrase, spatial is special. I think that we need to make spatial normal, not special. Next slide. Because I think at a certain point, unlocking the value of geo is less about tools and more about culture. I think that an organization needs to be aware that it can ask geo questions. Maybe this isn't a problem with something like a geospatial focused company where geo's in the name, but a business where it's not entirely clear that everything that you do has a location component. They might not be asking those questions. Is the organization aware of the technologies that it has at its disposal, or the resources in terms of people? Are these tools documented? Is this knowledge being shared? And I think a really key point is, are subject matter experts acting as gatekeepers or evangelists? So I think we need to democratize geo. So this is an example of a virtuous cycle. I think for a lot of analysis and product development, and the way that we do business and solve problems, I think typically people ask questions. We develop solutions, either methods or technology. We generate insights, and those insights help us to ask new questions. And I think that we tend to focus a lot as sort of an industry geo. We like to talk about sort of cool new tech and how it's advancing. So I think we think a lot about solutions, methods, and technology. And next slide, please. I don't think we focus enough maybe here on the asking questions part. Now maybe this doesn't apply to everybody in this presentation right now, but I think with regards to private industry, maybe we don't ask enough questions. And I don't know that that's the fault of most people. I think that as subject matter experts, we need to bridge the gap between ourselves and users, people who could really take advantage of this information. Here's my idea for a sort of idealized virtuous cycle. I think that domain experts need to, if they are acting as gatekeepers, need to sort of break down that gate and really become evangelists for geo within an organization, by sharing their knowledge, giving examples of what's possible, by training people, upskilling people, and hopefully sort of bootstrapping or kickstarting the virtuous cycle. And I think that could really help create a paradigm shift in an organization where maybe the technology isn't the blocker, but the lack of knowledge of what's possible is. Next slide, please. So to kind of sum, geo is a journey. And I think as domain experts and technologists and really geo people, we need to meet users where they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. I really like the concept of we need to make geospatial normal, not special. I think that's sort of a good summary statement of where we're heading. And I also appreciate your focus on travel, which is a very optimistic topic, a very positive topic in the time that we're addressing challenges relating to the pandemic. Thank you to all the speakers. I think the speakers in this session have represented the diversity of interests and issues, as well as perspectives that we go forward with. We have a few minutes for discussion, and I would like to sort of ask all the speakers to consider what are some of the potential next steps that you see critical to achieving the benefits from geospatial knowledge infrastructure, from each of your perspectives. One of the topics that I've seen in the chat so far is there's some interest in addressing how do we make these benefits more accessible to developing nations as well as the developed world. So if you would address that as well. We only have a few minutes, about 5 minutes for this, so I'm going to ask that each of you speak for about a minute. I think I'm going to go in the same order that we went with the session. And so, Tyler, I didn't want to ask you to speak back to back and to give you a couple minutes to listen before you speak again. But Mark, would you take a minute or so to address those topics?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, if I just have a minute to speak, I think I would focus on this idea that we've become accustomed to sharing tools. Tyler mentioned open source tools, right? So generally speaking, this idea of being able to go to GitHub, whether you're a large corporate customer of ours or individual, scientific researcher, there's many places where you can go to get access to many tools, including geospatial tools, right? So we're accustomed to that. We're accustomed to running on Linux, for example. But a lot of, I think, the success of the cloud versus on-prem has been around sharing data, open data. And I can't emphasize that more, right? So, for example, we have something called the Registry of Open Data. If you go there and you type in geospatial, you'll see many examples of data that's widely shared. And that to me is probably the most significant thing. That's the sea change that is, a function of the cloud, generically speaking. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Huang, could you say a few words to address these topics of next steps?
I think I'll start with the second question. I feel one common perspective related to the larger discussion on digital twin is that we should never lose sight of what is the problem we are trying to address. Whether it's the developed world or we see as the developing countries, I think it is common. We all face a various set of challenges and problems. We should be clear what is the issue we're trying to address and invest our focus, invest our efforts and resources to put in place the data infrastructure that is needed to address the problem. It is very easy to sometimes get distracted by shiny objects, and there's a lot of discussion of the many possibilities. We should not boil the ocean. We should focus on what problem we should address and target our efforts towards that. I think that applies for the GKI as well.
Thank you. Catherine, your thoughts?
Thank you, Carl. I think they're good points. I suppose I'm going to repeat them. I think the first one for me is adopting common principles and practices, particularly UNGGIM, IGIF, Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, for example, is a really good one, especially if we're looking at enabling developing countries to be able to adopt the wider use of geospatial data and information so that we're able to support them in their endeavours, share data and build global commonality across data sets, interoperability and the like, so that we start to have one seamless view of the world. I think that's going to be ever more critical as we move forward together. And therefore part of that is capability and capacity building. So it's not just about the technical capabilities, it's the usability for non-geospatial data experts and building those tools, APIs, WMS, so that it becomes as familiar to people in administration, in government, in organizations that are making decisions to use geospatial data as part of that decision-making process as easily as they would send an email or open a Word document. And so I think that enabling geodata become pervasive is going to be down to making it commonly used and have common user principles.
Thank you. Finally, Tyler, your thoughts on how we might go forward in making geospatial spatial normal rather than special?
Yeah, that's a tall order. I think that there are some things that make it a lot easier. I think continued investment in things like data portals, at least for me in my own organization, I've seen the adoption of a data portal that makes it easy for anyone to search for and find information, really kind of accelerates the virtuous cycle of people asking questions. I think it's important that we continue to educate people with basic principles when it comes to geography, geospatial concepts, geodata. It's not magic. We don't have to lock it behind complicated jargon and licenses. And in fact, I think one thing that could really help is just I think if people knew, for instance, more people were familiar with basic SQL querying skills, it's really not that far to be able, it's not a big leap to go from knowing how to use SQL to knowing how to do spatial querying in something like Amazon Athena or Google BigQuery or whatever kind of database anybody has, because we have a lot of standards and formats now, and I think that the technology's come far enough that now some sort of basic fluency in just geoprinciples could really push us along really quite far.
Okay, thank you. like to thank all of our speakers. I think you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of ideas to consider as we go through the rest of the summit. And there's been a wide range from, as we've talked about before, considering the cloud, urban issues, the blue economy, and focusing on interesting topics like travel, which is there. So thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to the rest of the program going forward.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Michael Lutz. I'm the Deputy Head of the Digital Economy Unit at the Joint Research Center, the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this panel on data partnerships and data sharing as key to the JKI. Data has increasing value today, and we can see that location clearly adds to that value. It's also a key part of many industries, and it's transforming the way that these industries work. It's transforming business processes, business models. We're seeing new partnerships being built around data value chains, and even new industry emerging that are being created around the value of data. In Europe, this has been recognized with the data strategy that was adopted last year by the European Commission, and that is aiming at establishing a European single market for data. And it comes along with a number of quite ambitious legislative proposals that are currently in the making, and that aim at facilitating the access, use, and value creation of data. And I know that there's similar strategies are being created and implemented around the world. Now, data partnerships and data sharing are key to all of these initiatives and to establishing the next generation geospatial infrastructure. Before I pass the floor to our panelists today and hear their perspectives on data partnerships and data sharing, let me use this opportunity to promote some of the work that we've been doing in the Joint Research Center in this area. Over the past few years, we've been working with member states in the European Union and have produced a location framework for public administrations that has quite similar aims to the Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure. The European Union Location Framework, EULF Blueprint, is the main outcome of this work, is addressing the sharing and the use of location information and adoption of interoperability principles by European public administrations. It's looking at transformations and in the way that public administrations work and how they could become more user-centric. So in that sense, it pursues similar aims to the GKI. If you're interested in looking at the practical guidance and the series of recommendations that they can also be viewed interactively, please get in touch and we can have a discussion about that. With that, let me welcome on screen the panelists for today's session. We have with us today Barbara Ryan, the Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council. Welcome, Barbara. We have Joseph Seppi, the Senior Vice President for the Geospatial Sector at Wilpert. We have Jana Gevorgian, a Senior International Relations Specialist at NOAA. We have Carrie Stokes, the Chief Geographer and Director at the GeoCenter of USAID. And Roberto Gigotti, the Director of EGEOS in Italy. Welcome. It's my pleasure to have you all on board. And without much further ado, I will pass the floor to Barbara. Please, over to you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Michael. I trust everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And listen, I've got just a couple slides, and as those are getting pulled up, I just want to say I've really enjoyed this morning's conversation already. I'm hoping that a couple messages will get reinforced, and then maybe during the discussion we'll come back to something that Peter Rabley mentioned from Place Fund, which is roles and responsibilities of the public and private sector. So I think you're going to see some of those teased out in this presentation. Thanks. I'm currently the Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council. I've got a slide at the end. Some of you in the audience are already members of WGIC, a not-for-profit organization of private sector companies working in the geospatial ecosystem. So let's go to the next slide. And we've talked about some of these elements already. It's not necessarily a comprehensive list, but for me, I think the key elements of data sharing and partnerships are really shown on this slide. Open data, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking about that. Clearly, there needs to be a smooth flow of data and information, and I think it was in Mari Wilson's from Geosciences Australia presentation this morning that kind of hit on this point. I would like to come back to that. Certainly standards and operability, and then hyper-partnering. And I'm calling it hyper-partnering because it's not necessarily efficient and it takes a lot of time, but it's absolutely essential. And I think, again, a number of speakers already have spoken about that. Let's just use the Landsat experience a little bit. You'll see it's the entire series of Landsat satellites going back to 1972. And for 30 plus years, the organization that I was in at the time sold that data, $500 a scene. It did transition to the private sector, you know, in the mid 80s for Landsats 4 and 5, and the price jumped to $5,000 a scene, and the market largely tanked, and so it came back to the federal sector. But again, kind of building on Tyler's last comment about gatekeepers or evangelists, I can tell you we in our organization were a gatekeeper. Now, technology was an issue to get that data out the door, but we largely had to sell it for $500 or $600 a scene to just cover kind of the processing costs, which should have been on the government side right from the beginning. So what you see here is it took me 10 years, but there were people, tens of people that were working this issue back to the first time the Landsat satellite was launched in 1972. NASA was very aggressive about it being an open access to data situation. So finally, 2007, 2008, we got the policy changed. You can see that before the open data policy, we were selling 53 scenes a day. After the data policy changed, it went up 2 orders of magnitude. The next slide will show you that the cumulative amount of data. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next slide shows that this slide, and I can't see the date. It's maybe 2013, 2014, over 25 million scenes. The number's much higher now, and we'll get better data on this. But the point is, essentially, not much of the archive was used before we transitioned to a broad open data policy. And so and I think for many years we were asking the wrong question. So how could both NASA and the Geological Survey, the US government, taxpayers in the United States have invested billions of dollars into a resource like the series of Landsat data, and then only be delivering 53 scenes a day? So I don't think we were even asking the right question. But the key message here, and this comes back to the relationship between the public and private sector, is actually shown on the next slide. So let's go to the next slide. An economic analysis that was done in 2011, now that's a few years after the data policy changed, showed that the annual economic return back to the United States was $1.7 billion. Globally, outside the United States, internationally, there was an economic return of $400 million for a global total of $2.1 billion. Now that far exceeds the $4.5 or $5 million that we, the Geological Survey, were taking in to sell 53 scenes a day. So, and Carl just moderated the last panel. He may have actually been a part of this economic analysis. the point is, not only were universities no longer having to spend their data to buy Landsat scenes, but the private sector came in, and the true economic growth was really from value-added products and services that the private sector brought to this asset. So for me, that's still needs to be a key message in this entire field, is that if you are a government agency, and honestly, it doesn't matter if it's a federal government, a state or a local government, or an international government agency funded with public taxpayer dollars, the data that you generate needs to be open, broadly and openly available, so that citizens don't have to pay an incremental fee for getting access to that data. And that will then start to unleash the power of the data, like we've seen with the Landsat data, and clearly the Sentinel series that followed suit with Europe taking that action. Next slide, and I think it's the last couple slides that I've got, and I'll turn it back to you, Michael. So again, WGIC, not-for-profit association. And if you could just go to the next slide, you'll see our current members. And I hope many of you in the audience are there, whether you're a patron member, a corporate member, an associate member, or an affiliate, which is at this time the Open Geospatial Consortium. We are open for business and would love to have you contact us if you are a private sector company working in this trade space. Michael, I'll turn it back to you, and then I do think maybe we'll tease out a few more of these individual points about roles and responsibilities in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, Barbara, for bringing up already the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, which I think is a key question that we need to discuss, and hopefully we'll get to that in the discussions after the opening statements. Next up, we have Joseph Seppi, who's the Senior Vice President for the Geospatial Sector at Woolpert. Joseph, the floor is yours.
As a survey and mapping professional in an organization that performs a great deal of first-order, high-resolution data collection, I want to talk about foundation data and how the GKI and data partnerships can lead to innovation. Partnerships sit next to foundation data in this GKI model. These elements are not only linked sequentially in a clockwise manner as is shown, but there are also many feedback loops between all elements of the GKI. For example, innovations in applications, analytics, and modeling can have a direct influence on partnerships and collaboration. I want to ask the question, how can the overall GKI make foundation data better? Not just how can foundation data make the GKI better? The GKI refers to data as the new oil. That is a good analogy, and to carry it one step further, there's the need for a refinery. Like crude oil, not all data are of equal quality, but it all has some value if you can extract and exploit it and make it into a standard consumable. Partnership plays a key role anytime multiple sources of data are used to create an authoritative map. For example, inputs may come from different companies, jurisdictions, government agencies, etc. Are they working in a mosaic to map pieces of an area, or are they mapping different features within the same area? Instead of requiring the inputs to meet a very strict standard through AI, ML, we could frequency inputs of different resolution, scale, accuracy, and improve it against a control network. So the traditional foundation data paradigm is 2 or 3 dimensional, singular, linear, and relatively static. Data standards and metadata are critical in this model as multi-source data are ingested, normalized, and fused together over time. With persistent data streams and Earth observation, we have the means to automate the map updating process with potential to take the human out of the loop. Total propagated uncertainty becomes much more appropriate than absolute RMSE and other accuracy standards. Insights from the foundation data are scale dependent. An expert information system using machine learning can detect objects and abstract them into a single topological model. Or we might want to have multiple authoritative base maps composed of the same data presented at different scales and dimensions, including spatial and temporal resolution, depending on the intended use, which from a digital cloud infrastructure standpoint would be highly efficient due to the cost of storing large quantities of foundation data. Maps are abstractions of the real world that strive to be accurate, portable, and realistic representations. Digital twins are really the next paradigm shift in foundation data, but right now, this is the Wild West, and it's begging for standards. In some ways, just as we approach high efficiency in maintaining foundation data, we decided to make it messy again by redefining what foundation data really is. So an adaptive foundation data sustainment model would spawn further partnerships through innovation. If we can have Geospatial 2.0, I suppose we can have foundation data 2.0. There is so much survey and engineering grade data being collected at higher frequency every day. Through partnership and innovation, we can leverage it to create foundation data that adapts to change and can have some amount of autonomy. And finally, let's not forget what geospatial data partnership can look like as we strive to take humans out of the loop in the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. Thanks for bringing in the additional aspect of seeing how technology and new paradigms such as digital twins and AI can actually be combined with partnerships in order to basically make them the most of the many data sources that we now have from all kinds of different data providers. I think it's a very interesting aspect to that discussion, and I'm sure we'll come back also to this in the discussions later. With this, I would pass it over to the next speaker, which is Jana Gevorgian, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Who's the Senior International Relations Specialist at NOAA, but also she's the incoming Director of the Secretariat of the Group on Earth Observations, starting in July, and she's going to talk about that in her speech. Over to you, Jana, please. No worries.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. And I think I'll change things up a little bit and I'll go without the slides. And I will speak indeed here from the perspective of the work that we are doing in the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observations. And if you are not familiar with the Group on Earth Observation, it's a coalition of the willing, over 130 member governments and also well over 100 participating organizations and associates who represent the science technology community from the private sector, non-governmental sector, civil society, trade associations. So it's really a community of partners who have shared interests in leveraging our advances in science and technology to develop tools, applications, resources for countries to use in their decision making. And as such, we have built our mission on the basis of principles of data sharing and partnership building. In fact, Barb, who spoke just before, she had her hand in that whole space of promoting this community of parties who share their interests. And GEO has spearheaded the global open broad sharing of data, publicly funded Earth observation data. And that is what has been powering our activity. So if you haven't followed us lately, you have a really great opportunity to see one of our fine examples of the work that we have done in partnership with governments, private sector, academia, cities, and that is the launch of the Earth Observation Toolkit for sustainable cities and communities that will take place tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, at a side event of the United Nations Statistical Commission's 52nd session. So if you're not going to be tuning into the summit, I invite you to head over there and see exactly what that work by GEO looks like. The speakers in the morning session spoke quite at length about the challenges, who, as Albert Momo said, are also the opportunities for extending the benefits of fourth industrial revolution to the developing countries. And within GEO, we are so keenly aware of these challenges and opportunities. And we are really doing our part to democratize science and access to big Earth data by really pushing strongly for open science, for use of open source and open software, so that the products, applications, and tools that our community develops in partnership with other sectors is available for reproducibility by developing countries, and so that they can be adapted to the local context, local social and cultural contexts. We really are taking advantage of the strong network of partnerships we have built in the science technology community. And I will venture to say that we've been successful, even though it's taken us years and decades to get here, but we have been successful in getting here because we largely speak a common language, a familiar language, where scientists, technologists in agriculture science, forestry, ocean, biologists, but we still speak the science technology language. I found it really interesting when in the opening session, Stefan said that when they first started to engage with the geospatial industry, Sanjay forewarned him that, look, these guys, they speak different language. And I think we speak different dialects of the same language, because I do think there are communities who do speak entirely different language. And yet, if we're speaking of partnerships, I think they are the next frontier of our partnership building. In Geo, as we produce these solution-driven applications and practical guidance for using Earth observation to inform decision-making, we want to be sure that this wealth of knowledge, this data that we unleash, it reaches the users. And I would very much contend that our ability to do that depends on our ability to establish connections, engage in dialogues with communities with whom we don't often find ourselves sitting at the same table with. And I speak of the legal community. We ought to be engaging in conversations, systematic and regular conversations with lawyers, so that the legal policies can enable our sharing of data, our dissemination of the information, so that the licensees can be streamlined and standardized or harmonized to minimize, if not eliminate altogether, the liability risk to the users who want to make the most of the available publicly funded Earth observation data, geospatial data, statistical data. So we need to be conversing with the lawyers. Not everybody likes that, but we must. We must be speaking to the financiers, with the bankers, with the asset managers, insurers, because they are the ones who bring the money to the table and can fund sustainable action. So informing their deliberations to minimize risk and determine realistic thresholds for risk using environmental information is also an opportunity for us. And I can add several other such communities with whom we do not engage systematically, but I would say that is our next challenge. And the challenge here lies in our ability to adopt new ways of communicating, because now those guys, they do speak different language. And I think we will have to be a lot more active listeners. We will need to be willing to come to the table in good faith to show that we are here to stay and commit to systematically engaging in conversations. And I know there are probably organizations who are already venturing into this space, just like the Group on Earth Observation is venturing. We are shaping conversations with the legal community, with the finance community, and we really would invite those of you in the audience in the summit who are also looking to engage these stakeholders to connect with us so that we can accelerate these efforts, because let's face it, sustainable action is a matter of today and not of a distant future. And we certainly don't have the luxury of time to build these really important connections. Thank you, Michael. Over to you again.
Thanks a lot, Jana, for bringing up these points. Clearly, the difficulty of discussing our topics with other communities, especially with legal, economic, financial, resonates quite well with us when we're discussing about data-related legislation, that is exactly what is happening, and I can really relate to that, saying that it's difficult, but it's really necessary, and it's where basically a lot of the important decisions and influences can be taken, and all the impacts can be had. So thanks for that. Next up is, sorry, I'm lost in my agenda, Carrie Stokes, who's the Chief Geographer and Director at the GeoCenter for USAID. Carrie, please, floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. So I think the data sharing and partnership theme is absolutely the name of the game where we are. So I'm going to give you some comments about what we do in a single U.S. government agency. You've heard more general, broad ideas coming from the previous speakers, but I'm going to give you some examples about how we are embracing, because we realize that we can't do this alone if we are to succeed in having geospatial information really drive decision making. So as Michael mentioned, I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we are the foreign assistance lead for the U.S. government. We work in about 100 countries around the world, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, in the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. And our development and humanitarian programs focus on saving lives, reducing poverty, strengthening democratic governance, and promoting self-reliance. So I'm the director of the GeoCenter within USAID. And the GeoCenter is a team of internal geographers and data analysts. We provide decision support to our USAID colleagues in our field offices in country around the world, as well as to professionals in our headquarters in Washington, D.C. And as you can imagine by our name, we apply geospatial technology, data analytics, visualization techniques to help determine where USAID should be prioritizing its program resources in those programs that we implement around the world. So for nearly 10 years now, the GeoCenter has worked to create a digital geospatial ecosystem for USAID. It's a continual, ongoing effort, and it is dependent upon data sharing and partnerships. And I noticed that both Barb and Jana mentioned the time that it has taken or can take for succeeding at these partnerships. And I will reaffirm from my own experience that it does take time, though we know that time is of the essence right now to fully realize a functioning global geospatial ecosystem. So this ecosystem that we're building within USAID is further enabling data sharing internal to our own agency and external with our partners who implement our programs in the field. It will allow, or it does, and it continues to allow recombination of disparate data sets, which in turn creates additional value that is greater than the sum of the individual data parts. And of course, the primary field for joining all these different data sets is the location. That's how we relate to so many different entities and their data. It really does provide the foundation for connecting digital data in this fourth industrial revolution that we're living through right now with digital technologies. I wanted to give you several examples of how the GeoCenter has been helping USAID to advance geospatial knowledge infrastructure through data sharing and partnerships. So I'm going to give you 5 examples. I've got many more, but I thought I'd stick to 5 for this conversation. So first and foremost, we realized when we got started, we had to establish an agency-wide policy to just collect activity location data. Where are we working? We didn't have a system or a policy in place for doing that. One would think we would, but we didn't. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's easy to say, it's harder to actually do. It required collaboration and partnering internal to our very spread out government agency. We worked with our experts, of course, in the GeoCenter, our experts in our policy making bureau, our experts in our legal office, our experts in our procurement office, and of course, our experts in our IT infrastructure office. But not to forget the very implementing partners, our contractors and grantees who are implementing our development programs in the field. So even before the policy that we now have was published, it was about 2 years in the making to get everyone speaking the same language and to understand and agree to the importance of having such a policy. The policy is in place, but it doesn't end there. Next, we had to build the IT infrastructure internal to our own agency to be able to collect, manage, share, and view the locations of USAID's activities with digital mapping technology. This is still an ongoing effort. It's been underway for a number of years now, and it continues to advance and evolve. Again, partnering internally with many of those same entities that we had worked with on the policy development. But it doesn't happen just by talking. It happens by continually working together and establishing relationships across bureaus inside of the government agency. And the infrastructure office is key to this. So the planning for their resources a year or two in advance of our budgeting effort was part of this effort. So next, we had to establish data sharing agreements between government agencies. That's the same as government ministries. For data that's not by default already publicly available, which is the easiest way for us as analysts to access and analyze and share our results with our colleagues, we then can go to other options like these data sharing agreements. And we fell into it because there was a large data set that we needed from another government agency that would never be publicly available because it was just too sensitive. But to get access to it, it honestly took about a year to establish the legal agreement between my government agency and the other government agency. That set the precedent for the whole agency on realizing we needed general data sharing agreements in place. So now we've worked with our lawyers, as well again with our IT department, to better put in place the templates for future agreements for data sharing. And so it's beginning to work now. And again, it took time and we had to have it or we really weren't going to have much data to analyze with the work we were doing. So the fourth example is that we now have the data, we now have the agreements in place, we have the policies. Okay, let's start analyzing it. So conducting the analyses and then building the capacity of our own user population, that is USAID staff, who are experts in development, in agriculture, in climate change, in education, in health, but they are not necessarily experts in how to apply geospatial analyses. So that's where our job comes in. Where we work shapes how we work. So the GeoCenter provides training and what we call the geographic approach to development. We've trained over 2,500 USAID staff around the world in basic geospatial data literacy and mapping skills, as well as provided them with technical assistance in about 80 field offices and every bureau in Washington headquarters, so they can become more familiar and less intimidated by all these big terms that we use with regard to data. And then the fifth example that I wanted to give you is we realized that we can't just do this internally and have an effect if we want to build a digital geospatial ecosystem. What we're doing now is empowering the next generation of digital mappers through a program that we've established called Youth Mappers. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's in partnership with universities around the world, private technology companies, and our own US government agencies. So right now, we are engaging thousands of students from 245 universities across 55 countries to learn digital mapping skills and to generate new data for development and humanitarian purposes. These data are shared openly on a platform known as OpenStreetMap, which contributes to the broader digital geospatial ecosystem for the world. So we have matured since the early days of the USAID Geocenter, and much has evolved with the digital revolution we're living in, what we now refer to as the fourth industrial revolution. And today, USAID has developed its own digital strategy. It was released about a year and a half ago to ensure that our development work takes advantage of advancements in digital technology today. So I wanted to end by letting you know, reminding people that while the T stands for technology, it also stands for trust. Over the years in the GeoCenter, we've learned so many lessons, and we've especially learned that to succeed with new technology and data for decision making, we must continue to focus on the people part of this equation. Technology cannot replace trust, which must be a deliberate investment in relationships, in collaboration, and partnership over time. So to take full advantage of the potential benefits of 4IR and a mature geospatial ecosystem, and all that it has to benefit society, we must continually build the trust with the people about the kinds of data that are being collected, how the data are being used, who can have access to it, and who ultimately controls it. So this component of trust is such a critical ingredient that it can really make or break the success of any map or any app for decision making that relies on a geospatial ecosystem. And this is one of the lessons we've learned. We didn't know it going into it as technologists, but it's one of the things we have learned. So my message here is we can't forget about the people. I suspect that others have come to that similar conclusion. With that, I will pass it back to Michael for our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. I think you made a lot of valid points there about the barriers that you may encounter in your endeavors of sharing, maybe even between government agencies, but also what are the key enablers for you to make the data sharing happen. And I think we'll come back to them, some of them, in the discussion as well at the end. Coming to our last speaker, last but not least, Roberto Gigotti of EGEOS, and he's the director there. Please, over to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Working in EGEOS, and I take care of the strategic development activities. Let me spend 30 seconds for some who don't know who EGEOS is. Let me put my presentation on. EGEOS is a leading provider worldwide level of geoinformation data and services, with particular reference to the satellite Earth observation. We cover the entire value chain of this sector, from the building of ground segment station for the acquisition of satellite, to the data distribution, content extraction and feature extraction from satellite data, and developing of service platform for the various vertical segment. We are in the business since more than 10 years, but actually you are coming from a team within Telespazio Group, having an experience of more than 30 years in the sector. We are very expert in the radar data processing, since we have been, since the very beginning, exclusive distributor of Cosmos SkyMed constellation, which is probably the most effective radar constellation today available in the market when we talk about the ground resolution, acquisition capabilities, and timely visit. The second generation of this constellation has been put in operation today, well, very recently, with the first satellite has been put in operation very recently, as I said. I invite you to go to this link to see all the details about technical and commercial offer. I wanted to a little bit pointed out two elements of our discussion that have been already touched during the conversation today and also this morning. It goes without saying that I'm really sustaining and appreciate the initiative of Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure, because I'm pretty sure that it's giving a lot of benefit to the society. Either we are talking about industry, government, or citizens. Everybody is, well, a lot of speakers have already touched the point of adoption as one of the key elements when we talk about data sharing, or in general geospatial knowledge infrastructure. as well as about collaboration among the various type of stakeholders, and in particular, been already mentioned, the public and private institution. I mean, I wanted to reinforce this message and looking a little bit on the meaning of adoption, because I think that in order to spread and to be sure that the adoption is very large, we need to focus a little bit on use cases, on coverage, and readiness to use. By coverage, I mean the availability of enough quantity of data and information, enough in the sense that this can be really useful for the user, and which can allow the development of services and application which can be spread out of a very large community of users. And you know why I'm saying that, because I can give you some various examples, but I would like to bring you a little bit back into history, to something that I lived in first person at that time, because if we think on what has been one of the drivers in the past that has led today to a massive usage of the digital geospatial content. I'm talking about content and digital information, cartographic information that we have on our mobile phone, on our navigation system, on our web application. I think we need to go back at the beginning of year 2000. That was mentioned also by Barbara during her presentation, because at that time, I was working for a company called Navigation Technology at that time, and we suddenly realized that the spread and of the usage of our data reached a good point when the coverage of digital maps was reaching the completeness of a country or a continent. So what I would like to say by that is that you know, in order to adopt something, there should be a minimum level, which sometimes means a global coverage. At that time, this fact combined with the essential release from the US government of the restriction in the use of GPS technology, made sure that made possible that these two factors, coverage existence and the GPS technology put together, realized the possibility for developing several applications, which today we are still using, like navigation, like cell phone with GPS connected, and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, the coverage and the combination between various stakeholders, in that case, a governmental organization and a private organization in the industry, made possible a very spread and very wide adoption of this technology. And in order to sustain also this statement, I would like to bring you a couple of examples where we as EGEOS are directly involved as leading provider of the consortium that is realizing the service. And here we are talking again about a collaboration between public and private organization. I'm talking about the European Commission under the program Copernicus, where recently has been launched a service called European Ground Motion. Again, in my opinion, this is a very important example, giving us the idea that the coverage, the level of coverage will be that much that I'm sure that everybody is going to use this system, because we know that whatever it is from now on in the next future, if you want to know some information about ground motion, we have a global coverage at European level. I'm sure that this is going to push the usage of this technology, the interferometric analysis, in this case using Sentinel data, is going to be developed, because everybody will know about this service, everybody will be aware, and the service will be spread and used by citizens and organizations worldwide, and I'm sure it will push a lot the adoption of this kind of technology. Another example where also EGEOS is involved as a leading provider in the consortium is the emergency management service from the European Commission, again Copernicus. This is something very well known to the community because it's on the way since more than 8 years now. But again, this is an example where we provide the service to the global European Commission and through the European Commission to the worldwide usage. So again, this is spreading a message about the possibility to produce rapid mapping in case of emergency. So it's giving the message that this technology is very, very helpful in critical situation for public organization, for industry, and for citizens. Let me conclude with one slide. Which is very much connected to the specific theme of the panel, which is data sharing. Allow me to bring again example of what we do as EGEOS, but I think this is crucial also in general, because when we talk about the data sharing, we talk about adoption, we need to use also and put in place the technology that today are leading this kind of adoption initiative. I'm talking about a platform called the Cleos, which is of course a cloud platform that allows the sharing of data, that allows in a marketplace the commercialization of not only EGEOS data, but in general satellite data and processing services. And I'm sure this kind of integration between different provider, open source data, commercial data in a very, very usable way, it is very keen and crucial for the adoption. With that, I would leave the floor again to Michael, and thank you for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Roberto, and also for cutting you. Sorry for cutting you short a bit, but we're running slightly behind time. So I think we have time for maybe one or two questions that I would ask to the panel. Gary, you brought up an interesting topic of trust in establishing partnerships, and this seems to be resonating also with the audience. So I would like to ask a question to all the panel and to see who wants to answer that. What are the regulation structures, maybe good practices from your experience that can help to build and then also to maintain trust among the stakeholders, so that we have long-lasting partnerships in our infrastructures? I don't know if you want to go first. I see Barbara is already smiling because Gary already had a shot at it. So Barbara, you go first.
Sure, I'd be happy to jump in on that. And I won't talk too much about regulations or MOUs or paper, because in my experience, it comes down to just personal relationships. If there's a person in one organization and a person in another organization that are committed to working together, I think there's actually no end to what can be accomplished. And so as I look back, at least over my career, the major advances, particularly when you're talking about either public sector or private sector or competing organizations within either of those sectors, for me, it comes down to personal relationships that are established and your intentions. If your intentions are to work together, you're going to find a way to work together. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Barbara. Anyone else wants to have a go at that question? Jana?
I maybe want to just say very quickly, 20 seconds. I believe a lot in the personal relationship. But in the recent time, I've experienced a lot also the importance to take care about the different cultural difference. It's absolutely essential to not ignore this point. I think every culture has its own specificity and its own good point. And the key is to put this together, even if there are big differences in culture.
Thanks, Roberto. Jana?
Thank you, Michael. And I'll just continue on this thread. I think we just need to, I completely agree. It all comes down to the people level. And I think the structures or regulations, as long as our institutions are allowing us to have conversations, the only structures and regulations are the human behaviors. And so I think we will need to start at establishing sort of the departure point and framing it as a shared vision. And it actually is going to be a very interesting exercise, probably, because sometimes, we say tomato, tomato, and we can be lost in translation a little bit, say the same thing in different ways. So even that, establishing our sort of point of motivation is going to be a very interesting start. But then after that, I think it's just making a commitment to stick with it. Imagine you are hosting your annual family party and you have this new guest who pops in. If this is a one-time appearance, you are probably not going to really care about establishing a connection and having a lasting, meaningful relationship. But if this guest keeps popping back into your family party, you really are going to want to have meaningful conversations that will endure. So I think we need to bring that message to our new connections that we are coming and we're going to stay. We'll be in your face. We're here for the long haul. And we're just going to work through our communication towards that collective action.
Great. Thank you, Jana. Gary, Joseph, you want to chip in as well?
I just want to say, yeah, I saw some of the comments and want to clarify. I totally agree with Carrie's comments on trust. My talk was more an exploration of the art of the possible in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. So hopefully that clarifies some of those comments.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think there were a few comments asking about removing the humans from the loop, and I think we need both. Clearly, it's the technology that we're all, I think, very familiar with, but also we, as several of you have said, we shouldn't forget about the people, and we need to make sure that basically we have the right skills, we have the right understanding, we have the right language, and we basically make good use of technology. The technology by itself will not solve and build these infrastructures. Carrie, I give you the last word because you brought up the topic of trust. So
sure, thank you, Michael. I agree with everything that every of the previous answers that just came. And I especially believe that for us to collectively achieve this vision, a collective common vision for a digital geospatial ecosystem, geospatial knowledge infrastructure, this fourth industrial revolution, today we are those change makers to change the culture, to be more assuming from the beginning, your data will be public by default. For that data that's not too sensitive to share publicly. I think that's a massive culture change that we are in the midst of. And if that's really going to be the more effective and efficient manner. And to get there, it is the people-to-people relationships. That's the things that we are doing now. I think that we will have a successful ecosystem in the future, but we won't have it unless today we continue to do exactly what we're doing here right now. I love the fact that we're virtual. I love that we've been able to manage to survive in the pandemic, to connect with each other. But we all do know we miss seeing each other in person sometimes. And that I don't think will ever be replaced by AI, at least maybe not during my own lifetime. So I am excited for what the future holds. And I do think that while I was trained as a scientist, it has come in handy to be able to learn to be a communicator as well. And those two have to go hand in hand to succeed for what we're trying to achieve together in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Carrie and everyone. I think these were great closing words. I think I'd love to stay on with you, go for a beer and keep discussing about these topics. So I hope we will have the chance in the not too distant future to actually do that. So thanks everyone in the panel for the really nice presentations and discussions, and hope to be in touch soon.
Good.
Thank you.
Good morning to all. It's definitely my distinct pleasure this morning to moderate this panel on integrated policy framework in support of the Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure Summit. I would say so far the discussions and presentations have been, I think, excellent, on point, and really all of these things that we have spoken to so far this morning, dealing with data, technology, people, as well as standards, are all part of the policy framework. My name is Ivan Deloach, and I'm the Executive Director of the FGDC in the United States, where we have the responsibility for implementing such a framework for geospatial data and technology. And we do this on a couple different constructs. The first is the Geospatial Data Act, which was passed this legislation back in 2018, which provides really the guidance and direction for all agencies within the federal government of the United States to support geospatial data collection and use across government. To support that, we also have a policy construct called the Office of Management and Budget Circular 816, which has been in play in the United States for almost 2 decades. And that too gives direction to agencies on what policy constructs they should be complying with to ensure the effective use of geospatial data and technology across government. Before I introduce my very distinct panelists this afternoon, this morning, I should say, just a couple of thoughts from my perspective. As I shared with you earlier, hearing some of the perspectives and opinions from many of the panelists this morning are very much in line what I believe is an effective policy construct in government. I do think there were some points made about the now very important role of industry in our geospatial community, but I think more importantly, I think government also has a very distinct role and continues to develop and collect data as well, but more importantly, it has a role in setting the table, as we like to say, for the ability to have effective partnerships, to be able to share data across various constructs, and then more importantly, to be able to impact decision making. I think that's something that's very critical as we think about these various infrastructures. How are we impacting the ability for us to make good decisions? I think we're in a great position now with our, at least within the United States, we're having a transition in our leadership at the presidential level. And we've already seen the priorities that they've established for us in dealing with, of course, COVID-19, racial inequality in the United States, climate change, as well as the economy. And all of those can be underpinned by the use and could also be very useful in serving those. Geospatial data can serve those in a very effective way. So we're pleased and happy to see that. I believe that having a policy construct in place and ready to implement is important. I think it's taken, at least from our perspective, a number of years to do that. But I think we're in a pretty favorable position now to be able to support our leadership. So we're happy about that. In terms of our conversation today, this is going to be a conversation for this panel. I'm going to introduce my 3 panelists real quickly. We have folks I think many of us are familiar with and familiar with their work. Dahlia Baldwin from the United Kingdom, who's the director of the Geospatial Commission there. We've been tracking the work that they've been doing, which I think has been fabulous in terms of their strategy. So we're interested to hear from her this afternoon in terms of where they're going. Mark Reichert, who's currently in his capacity as the chair of the National Geospatial Advisory Committee of the United States, will be providing some thoughts in terms of what he's doing and leading that group and really supporting a lot of the work that we're doing in the United States in terms of that Federal Geographic Data Committee. And then Dr. Zafir Sadiq Mohammed Goose, who many of us are very familiar with. I know I am in our work with the Global Spatial Data Infrastructure over the years, where he's the Executive Director for International Relations at Spatial Vision in Australia. So with that, I'll like to give my panelists an opportunity to share some of their thoughts, and then we'll engage in some questions and answers about policy constructs around the world. So Dahlia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. It's really nice to be able to speak to everybody today. So hello, my name is Talia Baldwin. I'm Director of the UK's Geospatial Commission. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk to you about the UK's perspective on some of the key policy challenges. The integrated policy framework is such a huge topic. And so I'm going to give you what is a UK angle, but hopefully reflect on some of the common challenges we all face at the moment and some of the more interesting conversations that we're all involved in. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas in particular. The first is around the implications of wider political conversations about geospatial data. The second is to just touch on the increasingly thoughtful approach to data access at the moment. And then the third is just to acknowledge the really interesting link to public policy questions about ethical, private, secure use of geospatial data that are surfacing at the moment. So just on the first of these areas, the conversations about geospatial data are happening a lot more widely than they have been in the UK, for sure. The data revolution's been pushing geospatial opportunities to the fore for a few years now, but political interest has really increased around managing impacts of COVID-19 and economic recovery, and definitely Brexit from a very UK-centric lens. So that brings forth a whole host of opportunities, we think, and some challenges as well. Opportunities mainly because ministers broadly now recognise that good data about location supports many other kinds of data-driven decisions. So the UK is thinking about how geospatial data needs to integrate with IT platforms to upgrade the public sector's capability, for example. In turn, this drives innovation in supply markets. It means geospatial data can be employed to tackle real policy challenges and not just service operational needs. So it's being applied across a range of sectors to support better town and city planning, infrastructure build at national scale, more coordinated marine data, net zero targets, redistribution of economic outcomes at a local level, for example. With it, there are some challenges, though, mainly centering around the question, how do we integrate geospatial thinking into our data policy priorities? The public sector is really very slow to move often. So there are technical and data standards challenges that we're thinking about how, for example, the integrated use of geospatial data can be brought into statistical analysis. The UK also has a fairly federated local and national political governance model, which poses some challenges across jurisdictions about best practice and coordination of efforts, something which the US and others no doubt recognise also. And then there's the question about how does public policy support markets where companies are doing much better with geospatial data than the public sector is doing. So India's approach to deregulation recognises the benefits of encouraging innovation widely. The second area I just briefly wanted to mention was the more nuanced discussion about data access, I think, that's happening. For a while, there's been an interesting debate about open access to geospatial data in the UK, and it's a big global conversation, I know. In the last few years, this debate has become more nuanced. From a strategic perspective, a mixed model is now more relevant. There is a willingness to pay where data that needs to be detailed and authoritative is costly to acquire and supply, and a recognition that a sustainable funding model is required to manage issues around data currency, accuracy, and trust. And then the final topic that I just wanted to touch upon related to the policy conversations that are happening now, I think, is the wider public policy data questions about ethics, public trust, privacy, secure data, market incumbents, that kind of thing. So, for example, the way geospatial data and public trust and privacy has recently been raised up the public consciousness and the political agenda due to things like COVID tracking apps or other global events. So we're asking questions about whether our laws are adequate to protect citizens and support businesses. So we've always known about the significance of geospatial data to these questions. They just now seem more broadly pertinent. So we're doing some work in the UK to collect data to understand how people feel and what they know about use of their own data. And then there's an impact on markets of tech companies that hold quite a lot of detailed geospatial information about us. That's also a much more widely discussed topic at the moment. And these 2 points connect. How do we get on the front foot about ethical use of data about location when we have very little sight of plans for how this data is being collected and used by these companies? So all big topics, really keen to get into a Q&A where we can discuss some of these further. Thanks very much. Handing back to you, Ivan.
Thank you, Thalia. Very excellent points, especially around the tension between the public and private sector and the roles there. I think that's still evolving. Data access is always a hot topic, and how do we do that in an effective way, and balancing the funding challenges. I don't think there's a specific model that works for all. I think it really depends on where you sit in government, but also in terms of your country constructs as well. And I think the challenges around ethics and policy is sort of a new frontier. I would say that the genie's out of the bottle to a certain degree, and we're still trying, from a government point of view, trying to develop policies that can maybe bring that back into the fold where we're not impinging on folks' rights, especially when it comes to privacy. And then COVID-19 and also the medical field it's a great use case for exploring some of those topics. So great. So thank you for your comments. Well, let's move to Mark Reichert. As I said, Mark is now serving as the chair of the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. So I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Ivan. And welcome to everyone. This has been a great session so far, and I really enjoyed the comments from the previous speakers. It's all building up, I think, to a great conversation that we are generating here. You know, Ivan is the head of, is working with the Secretary of the Federal Geographic Data Committee, which was created back in 1994. And it really was, in my opinion, the kernel of policy integration for geospatial. It really created the ability for the nation to bring together geospatial information coordinated across government and with stakeholders in a way that allowed the information to be available and to engage the community broadly in producing that information. It's been successful through its stakeholder network of federal, state, local, tribal, industry, and academic and other partners. But the task is more difficult when you have limited resources and when you have a nation that is spanning 50 states, U.S. territories, 3,000 counties, and 19,500 legal cities, townships, and villages. It's quite a challenge. And so I think despite the advances that have been made, it was really interesting that in 2008, the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, which I currently serve on, was created. It operates under a formal federal advisory committee process, and it brings together experts from across the different fields of expertise from public and private sector to provide advice and recommendations to the government regarding federal and national geospatial policy and programs, the advancement of the national spatial data infrastructure in the U.S., and the implementation of activities associated with the Geospatial Data Act of 2018, which I'll talk about shortly. It's become, in my opinion, a really useful tool for non-federal voices to be heard in the process of policy formation. And it really gives the federal government an opportunity to get informed of all those different perspectives before moving out on various policy activities. Now, the NGAC itself has addressed a wide variety of activities, everything from recommendations on developing the geospatial workforce to the economic value of Landsat. So it was interesting that Barb, the discussion this morning really focused on the transition of Landsat from its original model to now that open model that's benefiting the world. National infrastructure best practices, the formation of a national address database to save lives, property, and to promote good business. And the application of public-private partnerships and other innovative partnership arrangements to really boost the ability to grow the NSDI well beyond what it is today. That's another topic of discussion. Now, all these recommendation papers are available on the FGDC website, fgdc.gov/NGAC. And I ask you to take a look at those papers when you get a chance, because they're really opportunities to engage the government directly from a non-federal perspective. We've also had involvement in the National Strategic Plan for the NSDI. And of importance there is the ability to integrate geospatial policy with the broader federal data strategy and evidence-based policy activities. I think this is essential. It's one of the 4 major goals of that strategic plan. We're also supporting the Geospatial Data Act of 2018, and that's a major step to codify the executive actions that have occurred in the past that created the NSDI, but also to bring congressional oversight on the activities of the federal government and to encourage less duplication, greater efficiency of efforts. But the GDA has also had another effect, I think, and it's really in generating connectivity and integration between geospatial policy and major heartstring issues that are being dealt with in Congress. A couple of examples include the Broadband Mapping Act. It requires the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to generate modernized maps of broadband connectivity around the country. Is hugely important during this pandemic, of course. It requires that organization to work with the FGDC before commencing the modernization of that activity. We have a Landslide Preparedness Act that was recently passed, and it engages the NGAC directly, the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, to promote recommendations on the management of really important 3D elevation data. This is LiDAR data at a very high resolution that's critical to landslide preparedness and response. And more recently, the executive order on tackling climate change from the Biden administration includes the Secretary of Interior and the Director of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, as co-chairs of the FGDC to provide recommendations on making that information available to citizens at all levels. But I believe one of the more important activities that I think we need to focus on in the integration of policy is really engaging partnerships with industry, creating the kinds of partnerships that can challenge the current regulations, the current statute that we have in each of our nations, to be more open and amicable to creating innovative partnerships that can take us to the next level. And with that, I'll conclude and hand it back over to Ivan, and I'm looking forward to questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for those comments. And you really covered quite a bit in a short period of time. I think key points there are the importance of stakeholders, and they're critical. I cannot overemphasize the value that we've seen in the recommendations that we have received from the National Geospatial Advisory Committee over the past decade. It's been instrumental in driving the legislation that we currently have in place that supports the policy construct and framework that we're speaking to today. And then lastly, the partnerships. It's impossible to really, at least in my viewpoint, to sustain a national spatial data infrastructure without the partnerships for two reasons. It's a win-win for both. We heard from Carrie this morning about the need to trust each other, and that trust comes with incentives as well. It needs to be a win-win situation for partners, and it's a critical aspect of any infrastructure. And then the other, I think, point that you made is collaboration. Again, having a specific topic or focus that's important for partners is critical. You mentioned the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act as well, and that's one that I was remiss in not speaking to earlier. In that particular implementation, the geospatial community is intimately involved with what we call our chief data officers, who have the responsibility for managing data, all data. That's statistical data, I think Dahlia mentioned that earlier, but also economic data and social data in a way that makes it user-friendly and develops usable data for folks to respond to questions or significant challenges in government. So with that, thank you, Mark, and we'll now turn to Xavier, who I'm sure he has some very compelling and interesting comments he would like to share with us. So Zafar, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Good day. It's about 2 a.m. here, 2:30 a.m. to be precise, in Australia. And it's a great honor because the geospatial community is a passionate community. And we all are here, and we always talk about the contribution for a global cause. And GKI is a timely topic here. I see GKI more as an ecosystem that's emerging, which is inclusive and also kind of lines up with the motto of the UN of not leaving anyone behind. Be it structured data, unstructured data, be it good quality data, moderate quality data, whether there are challenges in bandwidths, but still it provides an opportunity to bring those data sets for a global cause and the community to use. A vision is that what I see personally from a private sector, as well as working in the policy advisory area for governments, over here in Australia as well as overseas is that more conversations are about open data and the maturity is there. And obviously the vision is that GKI will be the next step, providing a spatial data marketplace for government, NGOs and private sector to park their data and work with those data sets, not only with the data, but the analytic tools, the visualizations, platform as a service that will be evolved. But this could happen, the success of the spatial marketplace will happen only if clear policies are there. And therefore, this integrated policy is very important, which gives people the confidence and trust, which our previous panel speakers spoke about, that the private sector is able to capture very good data, but also their commercial intent is maintained, but also the licensing is kind of taken care so that the recapture of the data doesn't take place. So capture once and use many times would be possible. Of course, from a maturity perspective, the open data policy has opened doors. But what I see as observation is yet another portal being created. There's a competition. And therefore, I recall the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon Bonaparte was caught in the sea. And when he was thirsty, he said, "Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink." Similarly, we are in the phase of data, data everywhere, not a byte to be utilized. And that's what's happened without clear policies. Everyone is creating data, they intend to share, but policies are not very clear for them to be consumed. And I think there's a global conversation and very confident that GKI provides that next generation of beyond SDIs to think about this ecosystem. And I think policies are only made when there is an intervention required. As you saw Bob's presentation, the Landsat utilization with 53 scenes with not an open data policy and the impact when it was made free, how many scenes were utilized. So policy intervention doesn't happen for the sake of it. I think that's where policymakers always come and intervene. Otherwise, market forces will determine themselves to be utilized. If we all can mature enough to look into the marketplace, I think probably in next 5 years, we could see that with confidence, people are able to transact as well as the value of data is being utilized. Maybe at the transactional level, it might be free, it might be charged or moderate, but it brings people to share. Also, another concept that is emerging among governments in a federated structure, as Talia mentioned, is a shared infrastructure. The question is about every states are creating the data, but also they have their own data infrastructures in order to capture, process, analyze. But now the conversations are around how can we share infrastructure in terms of capture, in terms of processing, so that every state need not reinvent or allocate budget in order to have those sort of redundancy in the infrastructure space. So that's another conversation, but that will mature enough once the trust element is open and private sector can come into this conversation around PPP in those developing countries to make GKI possible. The last point I would like to share is around the conversation of geospatial and space domain. Space and spatial are being spoken together nowadays, and you could see some of the countries are opening up policies and they see space and spatial ecosystems together in order to have the collective harmonization of investment from the private sector, data captured and practiced, be it Earth observation or positioning, that integrated policy, there is a big demand. I think this is a great opportunity of geospatial industry who have really been forefront in the standards development, in the practice of data sharing, to work with the space industry in order to bring a harmonized marketplace would be my last comments. Thank you very much, and I look forward for the questions. Back to you, Evan.
Thank you, Zafar. I think that's an excellent point. And we're starting to see that evolution where our space programs are starting to collaborate more with geospatial and mapping and national mapping organizations and government. This has been a model that we've been promoting with the group and observations that Jana shared with you earlier, bringing the terrestrial programs together with the space agencies. There's just a lot of value in having that holistic look at the Earth and the ability to share that data, but it's very challenging, but very beneficial. I think the other key point that you've made is again emphasizing the confidence and trust that we can have between the various sectors. So very much resonate with that comment as well. So with that, we have a great deal of time, which we're happy to have. We're going to have I have a couple questions I would like to present to my panelists to continue with this dialogue and conversation around integrated policy framework. So I'll start with Thalia, if you would not mind. So the question that I have is, how can an integrated geospatial data policy contribute to greater good of society and the economy as well?
Wow, that's a big question. I suppose it starts with the, this is what we're all talking about, the recognition that geospatial data is an enabler of other kinds of activity, economic activity, environmental, social outcomes as well. So it's just understanding how fundamental geospatial data is to informing a great deal of other public policy priorities and decisions that the public sector makes in order to have itself run well, and also to support markets in the private sector to do well. So I would say a kind of an awareness and an acknowledgement of the fundamental nature to quite a lot of decisions that geospatial data kind of, the existence of that, the role that it performs in that respect. I think it's a different question about then how you, and it is the bigger question, isn't it, when we bring all that together. But I think that's the starting point.
Okay, thank you. Question for you, Mark. At least in your opinion, how will the integration of privacy and data protection laws under such an integrated data policy or geospatial policy framework affect their implementation? I think that's where we'd like to say the rubber hits the road. So appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, that's a tough one too. Probably more so than the other questions asked. I think it's absolutely critical that from a legal and ethical perspective that we keep privacy at the forefront of everything we do. There's a whole bunch of different ways that privacy can be exposed. Personal privacy. There's also issues. The NGAC addressed this with cultural and historical resources. You have a lot of heritage sites around the country that need to be protected, but by releasing that information, it could jeopardize those sites. I think it really starts with dealing with the federal statute and making sure that we have the ability and the agility to adapt to what are going to be and what are happening right now are the myriad of different changes in privacy as we can integrate more and more information. The unexpected is always occurring, and we need to be agile as a community to understand those implications and respond with appropriate policy to make sure that privacy is protected.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I do apologize for the tough questions, but they
keep them coming.
Yeah, they stimulate good dialogue. So Zafar, question for you. I think you've touched on this a little bit earlier in your comments, but since the focus of the GKI is the development of a geospatial infrastructure that is user-centric, how can the geospatial users, specifically government organizations, businesses, or citizens, be involved more in the formulation of an integrated policy framework to make sure that their concerns are addressed at the policy level?
Yeah. Thanks, Sivan. I think there are two aspects to it. Number one is, let me take an example of the property development sector, for example, which touch base with every one of us. I don't like to generalize, but with the current processes of the mapping agency to make an authoritative cadastral map, when interventions were done in order to find out right from the data capture to the release of the authoritative data for other utilities industries to lay their cables, the roads to be put across, and amenity to come across a property development block. Per day, from a New South Wales example, per day, it delays about $7,000 for the builder, right? So what happens is then the agencies like the water utilities, the electrical utilities go and create their own cadastra, and you end up in several versions of the cadastra. I'm just giving this particular example to see the impact. As if we can realize as geospatial community, including private sector and government, to make a fast supply chain so that we could reduce that wait period and decrease the amount of waiting for the property developer, then it's a bigger impact. The house prices are less, people can afford, and cadastra can be minimized, and there'll be one integrated cadastra. This is just a use case that I would like to share, which everyone can understand. So therefore, the user community could benefit out of this coalition of the government private sector coming across to see how fast can we disseminate this data, so that way the industry or the users can benefit and take advantage of the supply chain. So that's one aspect to it. The second aspect is the economic benefit. I recall my involvement in 2014 G20 when it was held in Brisbane. We had the Umadiyar Foundation do an economic benefit study where it came out saying that if G20 countries governments open the data, it would open up trillions of dollars of economic benefit. Immediately, the Australian state governments and the federal government looked for an open data policy. Previously, the citizens were charged with the government-based map, and from 2014, the policy changed to the open data, similar to Landsat, what Bob said. So therefore, economic reports, accurate economic reports, the value of geospatial information always measured across the industry globally. I know UK has done a study, Australia has done a study, and some pockets. But I think if we globally work across, I think the Alpha Beta report of 2016 was a recent one. But if every country through UN framework or whatever the framework that are available can produce those measures of economy, I think the geospatial data producers will benefit for the investments, and the users will more feel the impact. Sorry, it was a long answer, but I just had to articulate it. Thank you so much.
No, that was a great response. I appreciate it. Really, it sort of support at least the comment I made earlier about incentivizing. It has to be a win-win for both. But I also appreciated your comments and thoughts about use cases, and I'd like to ask the other panelists as well. What are your viewpoints or thoughts on the employment of use cases as a tool for driving policy integration? Dalia, I'll start with you.
Thanks. I think it's a really great question, and it's good to be able to shine a light on just how valuable using an approach that focuses on use cases is, because the decision makers across government have different kinds of capabilities and understanding of data, what's needed to improve access to it. And if you can somehow talk about the outcomes from a user perspective, and so demonstrate in simple language what actually is achieved if you have better data and investment into it, then that pays dividends. So, I mean, from a UK perspective, the Geospatial Commission that I'm a part of isn't really set up to take over what else is going on across the public sector, and so we set policy and think about the kind of frameworks for that with a few exceptions. So we're just testing whether there are clear, valuable outcomes related to particular use cases where we can lean in on behalf of others and coordinate some activity. And one of the things that we've done more recently is to have a look at whether we can coordinate access to utilities data. So the data that telecoms, energy and water companies have about where their underground assets are. And we've run a couple of local pilots and just being able to talk from a user perspective. So the strategic case is fairly narrow. We focused on safe digging and efficiency savings, so financial savings for companies who, instead of sending out an engineer or a surveyor that has to have a look, go out, travel somewhere, have a look at what's under the ground, ask a bunch of other companies to provide what is data in paper format, which takes a few days, reconcile all this, try and guess at whether that's accurate or not. If you have willingness from companies to provide access to a centralized platform to that data, you can cut it down to 6 minutes, something that would take 3 days. So just having the ability to persuade decision makers who would allocate money to improve data of the benefits from a user perspective has been really helpful for us. Absolutely. Great. Thank you for that response. Mark, your thoughts on use cases?
Well, I'll start with what Talia just said. But in addition, I think there are two things about use cases that really drive things home. One is to basically, back to Tyler's point in the earlier session, is to really give the decision makers who are not familiar with the term geospatial a very, very strong understanding of the value proposition of employing location information in the context of a big problem, a heartstring problem that they're concerned about. The second is to be able to challenge policy, to basically take a look at public-private partnerships. If we can understand the business models that are successful between public and private partnerships at a specific level, producing a specific outcome of benefit to both government and the private sector. If we can discuss that business model and begin looking at the existing statute and policies within government, and they vary in the US from agency to agency, we can begin understanding how we need to work the mechanics of policy change to make these partnerships a fact of life on a daily basis. It's going to be a tough road because there are so many different statutes and policies that need to be looked at by the legal community in government in order to initiate these types of partnerships. But by building those use cases and showing that success is there, I think it really creates and stimulates interest in pushing forward.
Thanks, Mark. I totally agree. It really makes the business case for the utility of the data and also the technology and the tools and analytics that support that. You know, we heard throughout the day about the importance of making a difference at the ground level or at the decision-making level. So Zafar, I have a question for you. I think you briefly touched on this a few moments ago with your comments, but could you provide a local to global perspective on how policy is evolving to support geospatial adoption, at least from where you sit?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you look at, I would take again a use case of standards development. Been active in the ISO area and also Mark from OGC. Usually the standards development, when we try to talk about a standard internationally, we look for best practice, which country has adopted, and we take that and put it for discussion and we modify it for other people's usage. So I use that analogy. Obviously, in policy, of course, we have different set of governments, different type of management structures. So therefore, one policy to fit all will not work. Obviously, the best practices like open data, obviously it's emerging in the matured economies, how because this data has been already paid for by the taxpayers and we will open up, and slowly it has become a moment and everyone is understanding. that this data has a value, and it more rather than cost recovery, it opens up the economy. That's what all the economic reports have communicated very well, that the value of geospatial information, if you're going to charge, it's going to be insular and never benefit. Again, that 53 scenes example of Bob being charged is a very good use case there. So therefore, I think the policy development, I think it's more on data, as I emphasized, Ivan, that it's about the analytics, and it's about the infrastructure, shared infrastructure. I think those are the gaps, because data is one part. Once the data is created, if we can put it across a website, but after that, what? The supply chain stops there and thinking stops. People need, that is, I'm talking more from an outward or external view, because they want to utilize this data and readily integrate in the business workflows. Policies are not very clear there. Again, we can speak about, another good example is the adoption of the Creative Commons data licensing framework by different economies and governments, because that helped them to implement the open data policy. And that's another example from a global to a local level that has disseminated and is well practiced. Hope I answered your question.
You did. Great. Thank you. This question is for you, Thalia. As I mentioned earlier, we've been tracking some of the great work you've been doing with your strategic planning process. So the question that I have is, how is the Commission's national policy designed to remove barriers and to support the industry adoption of that plan?
In small steps, in summary. So, understanding what the barriers are is key. We've done. So I think it comes back to the some of the benefits that Mark was talking about around use cases, where there's such a complicated picture of governance and regulation across different policies that are relevant for geospatial data, how geospatial data can improve and deliver government priorities, that you can come up with a set of principles. The digital twin kind of movement is probably an example of that. Something that people think will probably rightly lead the way in a particular direction, but doesn't quite drill down to the level of what kind of things do you need to change, what kind of regulations do you need to change in order to make kind of data more accessible if you want to link it into a digital twin for a particular purpose, for example. So what we've done to start with is have a look, like many others, I think, of where the value lies in the private sector for the kind of activity that's going on at the moment. We published a market study that was UK focused, not more widely. I know that the World Economic Forum has been doing some wider work on data and how it's supporting innovation and adoption of new technologies more widely around the same time. So we published that because we wanted to ensure that the conversation was about the opportunities across markets as an ecosystem rather than for a particular sector, although the geospatial sector is very relevant in terms of the supply chain. So how data is provided and used and what services are offered. But it's really hard to model the value as well. So I'm mentioning all the challenges, but how on earth do you get to grips with the economic value of something that is contained within a particular sector? It's provided to bigger companies as either kind of raw data connected through telcos, or there are really big bits of tech companies or bigger businesses like estate agents that just have their own functions to manage the collection and use of this data. So we started by having a look at what the evidence is that supports where the value is in different bits of the market where geospatial data is being used more increasingly. And then I think it's important for us to identify the distinction between some of the more broader regulatory approaches we can take, for example, around data privacy, where you can have a look at whether current regulations adequately apply to things like access to location data, and look at it through the lens of broader data policy, and then understand where there might be other kinds of regulations or governance models, so how things are set up in the public sector, where access to data is actually quite tricky at a more local level. So just those kinds of categories of regulatory issues that have come up because of how things are just set up and how they've always historically been set up. So that's a very complicated answer to a kind of
No, it's a very complicated question, and I thank you for that. You know, we've struggled a bit in trying to quantify that, you know, that value benefit. I think we heard earlier today about, you know, the Googles and Esris of the world, but they're using a lot of government data. You know, they're doing value-added, providing value-added products to that data, but it's still a great deal of government data is being used throughout the industry. So I think that's it's a great example of how that works. So with that in mind, Mark, I have one more question for you. You know, you've been involved in developing some recommendations on public-private partnerships for the FGDC, and we've heard about the value of partnerships in the previous moderated session. So maybe not an easy question, but how do you see partnership models evolving? And specifically, in particular, what role are partnerships playing in the delivery of data and geospatial knowledge, which is the topic of today?
Yeah, I think you know, the key to the partnerships is that sharing of risk and reward, and the innovation of industry. And going back to the earlier conversations, you know, we are experiencing a major shift of data production from government to industry. It's take a look at weather. And all the organizations now on the private sector side that are not only generating observations that are location enabled, down to the hyper local level globally with satellite constellations and other things, to the provision of analytics and modeling for a whole range of what we would call non-core functions that are essential to the market, insurance and other areas. So I really think the opportunity now is to build these public-private partnership models specifically to allow the government to be able to use and retain that information that's produced by industry with the appropriate licenses and agreements, while letting industry benefit as well from value adding and other types of revenue generating capabilities. This has always been a tough area, you know, between government and industry, is establishing those joint value propositions. But you know, in the case of the pandemic, I think we can all agree that a lot of the information we needed to get in touch with that didn't come from government. It came from industry. It came from mobile devices. We need to figure out as a community how these public-private partnership structures can allow us on a near real-time basis to access information that we knew we needed, and often information that we didn't know we needed before. And I think this is a key for us moving forward, is establishing that agile, innovative environment for partnerships. I'm a real fan of a national forum where government, industry, and everyone else can get together at the table, local to national, to have that conversation and look and create new ideas, and then bring those back to the lawyers, figure out how we do it in terms of policy and program.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. So I think we have time for one more question. And speaking of roles, this will be for you, Zafar. Given your role with UNGJM, what key policy or framework do you see supporting scaling the adoption of geospatial data and technology?
I'll go back to the UN and the World Bank work on the integrated geospatial information framework. And in the 9 pathways, there is a policy and legal framework that clearly articulates how we can bring a united way of forming local policies and disseminating at a local level. I think that framework exists, and in a GKI, if you are able to take that sort of the template and apply it in the country level action plans, that will help various forms of government. The other way to look at, just to complement on Mark's point on PPP, I would like to recently highlight the Indian government, as Talia has also mentioned, that to deregularize, but at the same time, that encourages more private sector partnerships with the government. As I mentioned previously, the policies are only amended or developed for an intervention. I mean, we could see from our own example, BIM was mandated in some countries. Everyone thought that's a good idea, but then it worked out. And now we're talking about digital twins. The use case of Korea, if you go back, the Korean NSDI, why was it created? It was created because there was a massive gas explosion of pipelines. When they want to do the mitigation and rescue operation, they did not have clear asset maps, underground map, and therefore it forced them in order to think about how do we need to have data in order to work around the urban environment in terms of these sort of disasters. So I think the policies that comes across through the IGIF framework, there will be a library of policies available to the global community so that they can take that and fit it across. Another good use case is the UK Act on Anti-Bribery and Corruption. Even though it was a UK Act, immediately other countries adopted it to fit it across, and private sector industries or big corporations, irrespective of the geography, were able to look at it. So that's one good thing. Another thing is the European GDPR on privacy. Again, that was another use case that was worked in Europe, and most of the countries tried to adopt it. So therefore, the evolution of the policymakers around new policies will be based on intent. And if these policies are friendly with private sector, that encourages the private public sector participation and more investments into the geospatial sector. That's what I see. A very strong policy will uplift. And I think GKI is the ecosystem, and the IGIF and other frameworks along with GKI will help a very sustainable environment. And the future is very bright for geospatial sector. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zafar. And that was a very good set of concluding comments. I'll just add that you know, we heard today in our conversation the importance of policy frameworks and how they are drivers, and how the underpinnings of that are really use cases and business models to be able to incentivize government to support such constructs. It's also very important to have that personal aspect, the partnerships, as a component of any policy construct. And as we think about and continue to build out on this geospatial knowledge infrastructure, it's very important to have these in place. And I want to take an opportunity now just to thank my panelists for their responses and their comments. It was really very fascinating session today. And with that, I also want to thank the audience for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you may be. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Anamika, and thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan, for conducting an interesting panel on integrated policy framework. Indeed, a very interesting day that we had today, with the theme of the day beyond geospatial knowledge infrastructure, redefining ecosystem. It was a very interesting discussion that happened, ranging from the concept to how geospatial industry is adopting to the changes in the 4IR technology ecosystem, and deliberate on ways to improve that integration. It was definitely a very good discussion on how changes in wider digital industries are relevant to the geospatial community, and how GKI needs to achieve to increase the benefits, and definitely policy, which is a very key. And the views presented by the panelists on how government policy making should or could become more integrated in driving greater benefits for societies was really enriching. With this, we come to an end of the first day of GKI Summit, and we'll see you all again with another set of panel discussions revolving around key theme on making geospatial knowledge infrastructure a reality. See you all tomorrow. Good day, good night, good evening, depending on the time zone you're in. See you tomorrow again.